attempt. Literally, I'm at a loss for words on this. Of course, we're grateful the Secret Service responded in such an efficient manner, identified the threat and neutralized it immediately. And unfortunately, President Trump is the only president who's ever encountered this much political violence. The Biden-Harris administration continues to vilify President Trump by calling him a threat to democracy, prompting political violence against him. Not one, but 2 assassination attempts. This must stop, and I hope that the temperature of the rhetoric is lowered, and this latest example of unacceptable political violence never reoccurs. But over the past 4 years, President Biden, Vice President Harris, and congressional Democrats have enacted an agenda that has made the cost of living skyrocket and made it harder to save for retirement. It's weakened our standing on the world stage and injected woke politics into nearly every aspect of our lives. Beginning with the American Rescue Plan, followed by the failed Build Back Better, and then the laughably named Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden-Harris administration and their allies in Congress have attempted to shape this country according to a vision articulated by their extreme left flank. But that's not the entire story. Federal agencies under the Biden-Harris administration have, at the same time, undertaken a similar extremist posture towards the federal regulatory regime, injecting woke policy into federal agencies and how they interact with the American people. The results have been devastating. I don't think I need to tell anyone on this committee that the American families are being squeezed by rising costs across the board. It is increasingly harder to succeed, whether you're in small business, a family, or even a student in this country under the current Democratic rule. That is why today the Rules Committee will consider a variety of measures that break down some of the most egregious examples of woke lawmaking and the regulatory regime of the past few years. Whether it's forcing unrelated far-left policies on our financial markets or retirement plans, whether it's openly disregarding immigration law, whether it's eliminating consumer choice in the marketplace or appeasing radical extremists at the behest of our greatest geopolitical allies, each of these bills addresses a problem that should never have happened. But the Biden-Harris administration and its allies created these problems that no one asked for. These bills bring sense to what has basically been nonsensical. Today, House Republicans are standing against the Biden-Harris administration and ensuring that American homes are safe, their retirement funds are secure, and that the funds that they entrust to us, the taxpayer funds that are entrusted to us, are spent wisely. People want their consumer choices protected. They want their First Amendment rights unquestioned. Each of the bills before us today addresses these important issues. In particular, I want to highlight 2 bills that are of particular importance to my home state of Texas. The first of which, the Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act, makes it crystal clear that U.S. law that illegal aliens who commit domestic violence are both deportable and inadmissible in this country. Such an individual is already abusing a deliberate lax enforcement of the United States immigration law on account of the Biden administration and the border czar. This bill ensures that the same lax enforcement does not extend to criminal domestic conduct. Speaking of lax enforcement, the No Bailout for Sanctuary Cities Act makes it clear that no state or local government, such as San Francisco, that refuses to assist federal immigration officials in enforcing the law, they're now going to be ineligible for federal funds to assist illegal aliens. These local jurisdictions, otherwise known as sanctuary cities, made the conscious choice to disregard federal immigration law. They should not be incentivized by receiving federal funds in order to do this. The No Bailout for Sanctuary Cities Act eliminates this perverse incentive to hold these cities accountable for their conscious choice. So I suspect we'll have a lively discussion today and I look forward to it. I would like to yield to my ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any comments that he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before we dive into today's meeting, since you raised the issue, I want to reiterate that there is no place, absolutely no place in this country for threats of political violence, no matter who it is directed at. And I have to say that I am so disappointed because while Democrats condemn what happened this weekend, I'm disgusted by what happened in Florida. But I've heard nothing from Republicans about the political violence being incited by Donald Trump and his running mate against the people of Springfield, Ohio. The children of Springfield, Ohio. 33 separate bomb threats. Hospitals, schools, city employees targeted. Kids evacuated. Parents scared for their safety. Kids scared out of their minds because of what was said by the former president and his running mate. These are kids. These aren't presidents or former presidents. These are kids. 18 schools are now under police protection. The Republican governor of Ohio had to call in the state police. All is a direct consequence of loony conspiracy theories spread by Donald Trump and his running mate. Where are the calls on them to stop using rhetoric that puts people in danger? Anyways, I just feel compelled to point that out. We shouldn't be having a conversation about political violence and then ignoring the fact that the rhetoric at the top of the Republican ticket is leading to bomb threats, school closures, and evacuations. In my opinion, if someone can't condemn that, then they're part of the problem. But now on to our agenda. This anti-woke stuff is just weird. Republicans still can't even tell us what woke means. It means whatever they want it to mean, I guess. And what these bills really are about is dividing our country, trying to make Americans hate each other, trying to keep people angry heading into the election. That's what this is all about. The so-called End Woke Higher Education Act is about Republicans using students as pawns in their weird culture wars. The Prioritizing Economic Growth Over Woke Policies Act is all about bailing out massive corporations. Sounds familiar? Republicans are obsessed with helping the rich and powerful. Another bill attempts to just gloss over the fact that Palestinians even exist. In their pursuit against wokeness, Republicans apparently now want to just say there's no Gaza, there's no disputed territories in the West Bank. It's all Israel and Palestinians don't matter at all. I find that totally awful and offensive, quite frankly. Another bill to target diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm not sure which one of those words they're against. Probably all three, if I had to guess. More bills to divide us. More bills to fearmonger and try to push their xenophobic and bigoted views. More bills to demonize immigrants and politicize violence against women. I mean, it's just disgusting. Especially considering that at one point, a majority of the Republican conference voted against extending the Violence Against Women Act. And now they have the nerve to come here and talk about violence against women? And of course, more bills to undermine and gut our nation's environmental laws, allowing more CO2 to get dumped into the atmosphere so corporate interests can make a buck. But they could care less about clean air or clean water. Look, here's the deal. Their weird obsession with woke, it's all cover. They want to use this culture war BS to distract from their Project 2025 agenda, distract from their burning desire to ban abortion nationwide, and distract from their Wall Street giveaways to billionaires and big banks. I mean, none of this is a surprise. They have the weirdest, wackiest, most extreme people in the country telling them what bills to bring to the floor. They are obsessed with controlling people, telling people what to do, and using woke this and woke that as a cover for their dystopian vision for what they want to turn this country into. It's horrific, and these bills are a total waste of time. This is a pathetic embarrassment. You know, rather than anti-woke week, Republicans ought to wake the hell up and do the people's business. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair thanks the gentleman. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses have will be included in the record. I want to welcome our first panel, Representative Tenney of New York, to the witness table. Representative Tenney, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the ranking member as well. And just thank you also for calling today's rules meeting and for including HR 5179, the Anti-BDS Labeling Act in this week's rule. The Anti-BDS Labeling Act would codify the Trump administration's 2020 U.S. Customs and Border Protection rule entitled Country of Origin Marking of Products from the West Bank and Gaza. In 1997, the Palestinian Authority requested that the U.S. require all goods made in Judea and Samaria and Gaza to be labeled as made in the West Bank or Gaza. This not only recognized Judea and Samaria and Gaza as one territorial unit, which is inaccurate, but also failed to recognize that different areas of Judea and Samaria are governed by Israel and the Palestinian Authority. The Trump administration rule required goods made in Area C of Judea and Samaria, which is fully controlled by Israel under the Oslo Accords, to be labeled as made in Israel. Under this rule, goods made in the Palestinian Authority-controlled areas A and B of Judea and Samaria to be labeled as made in West Bank. This rule appropriately recognizes the different governing authorities of various areas of Judea and Samaria, as well as ensuring that Gaza and Judea and Samaria are recognized as two different political areas. The anti-BDS Labeling Act would codify the Trump-era rule and prohibit federal funds to be used by the White House and the executive branch to alter this rule. For years, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, so-called BDS movement, has sought to cripple the Israeli economy and impoverish individuals living in Israeli-controlled areas of Judea and Samaria and Israel at large. The BDS movement has long targeted goods made in Israeli-controlled areas of Judea and Samaria, sometimes referred to by anti-Israel advocates as the occupied West Bank. I would also like to remind individuals that use this ridiculous term that the Oslo Accords, signed by Yitzhak Rabin and, yes, Yasser Arafat, divided Judea and Samaria into three areas, with Israel administering security control over 82% of Judea and Samaria and civil control over 60%. This bill ensures that there is no distinction in labeling between goods made in Israel and Israel-controlled areas of Judea and Samaria. During this difficult time, Congress must stand with Israel and support our greatest ally in the region, the lone beacon of freedom and democracy. I'm grateful to Chairman Smith of the Ways and Means Committee and all of those who voted in support of this critical legislation when it passed through the House Ways and Means Committee. We must stand with our greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel, and demand accuracy in the labeling of goods imported to the United States as required by our own laws. This legislation sends a clear signal that we will not tolerate arbitrary differentiations in the labeling of goods from different parts of Israel, whether a good is made in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Efrat, Golan Heights, Gush Etzion, it should be labeled as made in Israel. I look forward to seeing the Anti-BDS Labeling Act's inclusion in the rule and its passage through the full House of Representatives, and I'm happy to answer any questions on the legislation. And with that, I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back to your thanks, Gentlelady. I just want to be clear that this bill that you're discussing today codifies existing law. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is there any reason to expect that this would in any way impair the administration's ability to continue negotiations in the region?
Absolutely
it is
not.
existing law, correct?
No, it's just existing law.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing this to our attention today, and thank you for your time at the witness testimony. I'll yield to the ranking member.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, for the life of me, I don't understand why we're taking up this bill, and contrary to its name, it has nothing to do with the BDS movement. On his way out the door on November 19th, 2020, after the presidential election was over, then Secretary Mike Pompeo changed the rules regarding country of origin label for Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, so that goods made in illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank could be labeled made in Israel. It's no surprise that President Biden overturned this rule when he came into when he came into office. But here we are, and let me just say for the record, I for one still believe in a two-state solution or a means of coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians, and that will not happen by sanctifying the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank by labeling their products as made in Israel, or by labeling products made by anyone in the contested areas of the West Bank as made in Israel. I don't think this helps at all if we're interested in trying to bring calm and peace in the region as we speak. I also want to just read a brief statement from Earl Blumenauer, the ranking member, who writes in, who was supposed to testify here today but couldn't make it. He said he expresses his opposition to H.R. 5179. And he says this legislation impairs the Biden administration's ability to pursue a viable two-state solution. He says that H.R. 5179 codifies a policy set forth by the Trump administration, marking goods produced in Area C of the West Bank as made in Israel, requires an act of Congress to repeal this authority, and ensures that no funds can be used for the Department of State to modify this policy. This interferes with the State Department's ability to carry out foreign policy priorities, including supporting a two-state solution. It does not provide the needed flexibility to achieve these goals. The State Department has identified policy flexibility as critical to ensuring both peace and security for Israelis and the Palestinians. This legislation does nothing to address the conflict in the region and is inconsistent with foreign policy goals. I urge you not to move it to the floor of the House of Representatives. Sincerely, Earl Blumenauer was a member of the Ways and Means Committee. And so I don't have anything more to say. I don't think this is going to ever make it to the President's desk, but I just wanted to enter that into the record. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Tenney, for bringing this forward. I appreciate being able to stand with our allies, with our most important allies in the Mideast, Israel. And so I appreciate you bringing this forward, because we need to be doing things like this in order to make sure they understand that we are standing with them. And I do have to just comment. I came in just as the ranking member started his opening statement, and I apologize for being a couple of minutes late, but I was concerned what I did here, because you're throwing out a lot of accusations about what Republicans are doing, and I think we are getting very close to the questioning people's motives, and what you're saying is just incredible. I'll yield.
Yeah, no, what specifically did I say that you object to? I mean,
Ranking member, there was all kinds of accusations, and I didn't have a chance to write them all down, but there was all kinds of things about our motivation, how we're trying to control people, as I recall. I'm trying to recall.
Oh, and this anti-woke agenda, yeah.
But yeah, you're trolling people, and there was all kinds of accusations in that opening statement. And I would just say, I appreciate that you're opposing the legislation that we're putting forward, but all of very little of what you had to say actually, has to do with the legislation in front of us. You were talking about how we're trying to ban all abortions. You're talking about all kinds of things like that in your opening statement. And I wish I would have taken better notes so that I would have exact things. But if you have a prepared statement, I'll circle it for you. What I found concerning. But I just think that we really need. We're in the Rules Committee, and we are looking at these pieces of legislation. We need to, not go off onto all of the accusations and the things that you were talking about in your opening statement, and look at the legislation in front of us. But I do thank Ms. Tenney for bringing this legislation forward. And unless you have something else you wanted to add, Ranking Member?
No, I stand by everything I said. I'm really frightened of Project 2025. I'm frightened of some of the legislation that we're bringing to the floor. And again, I would just say that, the government's about to shut down in a week. And rather than working to keep the government open, we're doing this. I mean, I don't know, maybe our priorities are different, but I actually think that we have a responsibility to make sure the government doesn't shut down. And that's not what we're doing today. So I am frustrated by the priorities of this majority, and I don't think we share the same values. If these are the most important things to bring up at this very important moment.
And Ranking Member, that is a perfect example. We don't share the same values. Somehow degrading what anyone else in the place believes is an issue, and it does not make it a place where where anyone wants to negotiate or talk to others, because you continue to just throw out these accusations of all of these horrible things. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm going to yield back unless, because the Ranking Member has accused me of cutting him off repeatedly in the committee, so I would offer him another opportunity. But you just continue to choose words that create more angst than anything else.
Well, I would just simply say to the gentlelady that, for example, we don't share the same views on women's reproductive rights. And, you know, I believe that abortion ought to be legal and safe for women. Many of my friends have a different point of view. That's when we don't share the same values. That's what I'm talking about. I mean, we have a fundamental difference. And, you know, and I think, you know, the differences are pretty significant. That's just one example. But in any event, that's what I meant by that.
But almost every opening statement that I hear from you gets very, very close to really, you know, to questioning our motives and questioning, you know, what we believe and everything instead of, and it's full of accusations and continues to be. But and I know the chair would probably like to move on, but I do have to point out when those opening statements get so out of line that that I feel like you need to be called on.
It's what I believe. It's what I believe. Thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chair.
All parties have yielded back. The chair is now pleased to recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for her questions to the witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And unfortunately, I do share the ranking member's frustration that we are days away from a government shutdown and there is no plausible solution in sight. And instead, we're considering another raft of bills that are going nowhere except to stir up trouble. You know, the 118th Congress is almost over, and at the rate this Congress is going, the whole country is just going to breathe a sigh of relief. Despite having the opportunity and the privilege to move legislation for the good of the country for almost 2 years, our Republican colleagues have accomplished almost nothing. They've flirted repeatedly with government shutdowns and throwing the U.S. economy into chaos, engaged in weeks of inter-party disputes, even ousting their own speaker, and repeatedly reneged on bipartisan bills, including important appropriations and immigration bills. So what they've excelled at is bickering with each other, pushing culture wars, and failing to even make a pretense at working across the aisle. As we begin this session week, our colleagues have teed up another roster of culture war bills as part of the same old partisan playbook, half-baked bills designed to pick fights, not solve problems. Today, we see our Republican colleagues trying to make their war on woke happen again, with bills attacking colleges and universities, businesses, investors, and retirement fund managers, all of whom they've deemed, quote unquote, too woke and therefore in need of government regulation. For all their talk of small government and individual liberty, House Republicans are increasingly trying to use the full weight of the federal government to tell Americans what they can and cannot do, whether in their investment decisions, their colleges and universities, or their doctor's offices. It's a play they've spelled out in their Heritage Foundation playbook, Project 2025, in which they effectively say, if you don't submit to our weird ideological demands, we'll punish you. And as a result, we see a singularly unproductive Congress, members who are united only by anger and frustration, and Congress being weaponized by our Republican colleagues as a bullhorn for grievances, conspiracy theories, and negativity. My constituents are sick of it. I think most Americans are too. They want Congress and political leaders who don't embrace name-calling, division, and bullying. They want a government that brings people together, a government that works together for the people. So rather than wasting time on these divisive, dead-end bills, Congress needs to pass legislation to fund the government. Funding expires in just a few days. In the time we have left, our only real option is to pass a short-term, clean continuing resolution. House Republicans need to bring a clean CR to the floor now, and anything else is wishful thinking. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for questions.
Mr. McGovern, you know, you do, as Michelle mentioned, you open each one of our hearings with all these partisan comments, but the one that took the cake today was you mentioned the children that were killed in Gaza. I think was that who you were referring to? What children were you referring to?
The children in Ohio who are scared out of their minds because of the threats that are going to their schools.
Okay.
That's what I was talking about.
What about the children, the 300,000+ that have come over the border unaccompanied, that we have no idea where they are? That's 4 football stadiums. Where's the empathy for them? During the invasion at the border, you've said nothing while this administration has violated the Constitution. Where's your empathy for the children? Where's your empathy for the deaths that have occurred? You don't, you're a good man, but you're not, you pass these part. Let me finish and I'll let you respond. But making the comments about having empathy for the children in Ohio?
Yeah.
Where's your empathy, again, for the 300,000+ that are coming across here unaccompanied, that are either dead in a sex trade or wherever? Crickets from your side. And to say that, we're advocating for abortion, I call it killing children nationwide, show me that. Show me where that's happened. The reversal of Roe v. Wade put it back to the states. You know that. So I would just say the partisanship, but now talking about the children, that was something that you cannot address unless you address the invasion over this border. I'll let you respond.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to agree on everything to agree on something. And I would like to think that the something we can all agree on is that the rhetoric about Haitian immigrants and eating dogs and cats and the threats that have come to the schools and to the town hall in Springfield, Ohio. I'd like to think we could all say, enough with the conspiracy theories. Let's stop talking about that for the sake of the children in Ohio who are scared out of their minds because of the threats, because now they have to have, their schools are surrounded by police. We can get into the other stuff if you want, but I'm just simply, that was what I was talking about. And I don't understand why that's so difficult.
Where's your empathy for the 300,000+ children?
I have empathy for all children. And by the way, border crossings are at an all-time low right now.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Well, let me just say this.
The Trump administration.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Let me just say this.
We mustn't talk over each other because the clerk can't record that.
Let me just say this. I took offense at that because you're crickets when it comes to those 4 football stadiums full of children who are defenseless. The moms that were testifying about their dead siblings, the dead ones as a result of this illegal immigration, crickets from your side. I don't know if anybody wants to experience what this country has experienced over the last 3.5 years, and that will be, we'll see how that turns out at the polls. Claudia, or Congressman Tenney, what power does the CBP have on the labeling to, if it continues to come back, I would assume mislabeled, do they not take it? Do they not accept it? What do they do?
Well, thank you, sir. First of all, I just want to clarify something that Mr. McGovern said, and I think that the chairman asked me this question to clarify, but the bill codifies, the bill that this law codifies has not been overturned. This is still in existence. We're just codifying. It was nothing that the Biden administration hasn't overturned it. There were just accounts of that. So what this does is just ensures that the people in Judea and Samaria be able to refer to their goods as made in Israel. And that is an expectation we have as a nation. We like to know where our goods are from. For example, am I at the market buying something was made in China? Is it beef from China or beef from Texas? What am I getting? And it just gives us as American citizens the expectation of who's created it. If it's something from the West Bank, it will be labeled from the West Bank. And that it just makes sure that we can't erase that something is being produced from Judea and Samaria. And there were some accounts that the administration was thinking of doing that. And this in no way interferes with the attempts to try to find a peaceful resolution in Israel. But it protects those people who are living there. But right now, it's something that we're concerned about, and we think that needs to be made into law to assert that we support, especially our greatest ally in the Middle East, the lone democracy, the state of Israel, who's at war and under siege. And so that's merely all this bill does. It's not that complicated. It's not controversial. It's not political. It's not weird, extreme, or wacky, which I think the words Ms. Fishbach wanted to talk about. It is a common sense bill that is just codifying something that has been in law since for almost 4 years, actually.
Thank you. I support your bill, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair is pleased to recognize the gentleman from Georgia for his questions.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I won't ask any questions. I would just point out that we have a $2.5 trillion deficit over the last 365 days. Most of us in the Republican Party think that's too high. We do not want a government shutdown. The only one who wants a government shutdown are the ones that are crying the crocodile tears around here in the Democratic Party because they think it gives them an advantage in November. And I actually think they're probably right on that it does give them an advantage in November. And so, you know, we've put several of the appropriation bills on the floor of the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, Chuck Schumer, the crier that he is, has refused to put any appropriations bills on the floor of the U.S. Senate. And so if the government shuts down, the idea that it's House Republicans' fault is absolutely ridiculous. You could say it was all of our fault, Democrats and Republicans, but you can't simply blame it on House Republicans when Chuck Schumer has the ability to put bills on the floor of the Senate and just totally refuses to do so.
Chairman, yield to me?
Sure, I'll yield.
Yeah, I would just point out that none of the bills that we are dealing with today or this week have anything to do with the $2.5 trillion.
But we're going to have a vote
Yeah, and
later in the week to keep the government open.
Are we?
And if you want to keep the government open, you'll have that choice.
I just also want to point out for the record that everybody has a lot of strong opinions about what I said, but Ms. Fishbar couldn't remember what I said, and Mr. Norman misrepresented what I said. So I'm just pointing out for you that none of the bills dealing with the underlying issue that I raised or Ms. Scanlon.
I don't have strong opinions about what you said. I realize this is the ugly part of what we do in here in the Rules Committee, but factually speaking, if the government shuts down, the ones that are going to be jumping up and down and cheering for the shutdown are going to be the Democrats because they think it helps them in the November election. It's not the Republicans. The vast majority of us are going to vote to keep the government open, and 100% of y'all, I bet, will vote to close it down. Thank you, and I yield.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Seeing no other members seeking to question the witness, this panel would thank you for your testimony. This panel is excused. And I would like to welcome our second panel, Representative Huizenga of Michigan and Ranking Member Waters from California, from the Committee on Financial Services, to the witness table. And as you get settled, Representative Huizenga, we welcome your testimony.
Well, thank you, Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the Rules Committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on H.R. 4790, the Promoting Economic Growth Over Woke Policies Act. To ensure our financial system remains the envy of the world, we must promote sensible policies that encourage innovation, improve access to investment opportunities, and foster economic growth. That means Congress and financial regulators must balance policies that promote a vibrant financial system and a capital formation with those that protect investors and consumers. However, under the Biden-Harris administration, supposedly independent agencies have been hijacked to push through a very partisan environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, agenda, reversing long-standing efforts to keep politics out of the financial system regulations. Unelected bureaucrats have hijacked and overhauled the public company shareholder proxy process, adopted rules and guidance that exceed their statutory authority, redefined the materiality standard, which has been a legal precedent for decades, and ceded authority over American financial regulation to global governance bodies. In other words, rogue regulators are forcing companies to waste their limited time and resources on ESG mandates that have little to do with a firm's financial performance, and in fact, an ignored fact that is oftentimes glossed over is that these companies, by law, must disclose material information, otherwise they are literally breaking the law. Now, does that make sense? Who does it benefit? It certainly doesn't benefit our banking system or capital markets, nor does it help consumers, workers, job creators, everyday investors, or retirement savers. That's why House Republicans are fighting back with H.R. 4790, the Promoting Economic Growth Over Woke Policies Act. This bill is almost 2 years in the making and is a product of a collaborative process that included nearly every single Republican on the Financial Services Committee. Last February, Chairman McHenry formed the committee's ESG working group for the Republicans, which I am honored to lead. Through numerous meetings with stakeholders, the working group developed an interim report, which was released last a year ago in June, and a final report was released just in August. Committee Republicans drafted dozens of bills to address the risks posed by the ESG agenda, which are outlined in the working group's reports. These efforts culminated in a markup of 4 legislative packages in the Financial Services Committee, including my bill called the Guardrail Act, Congressman Stiles' Protecting Retirement Savings from Politics Act, Congressman Norman's Business Over Activists Act, and Congressman Loudermilk's America First Act. Those bills were combined into the Promoting Economic Growth Over Woke Policies Act, which is part of the rule being considered here today. So let's recap. Under the Biden-Harris administration, rogue regulators are weaponizing independent agencies to pursue the ESG objectives of the far left at the expense of our financial system and everyday investors. Frankly, Mr. Chairman, they know they can't get those rule changes through the legislative process, so they have been trying to use their own authority and power, and they've been losing at the court level on a number of those attempts. But this includes abandoning the materiality standard, which has been a pillar of our securities laws for decades and a key contributor to the dominance of American capital markets. The proxy advisor duopoly and large asset managers are abusing their outsized market influence to force left-wing political views on public companies rather than aligning their shareholder voting with financial interests of investors and the economic goals that they have. An alliance of left-wing activists, unaccountable global governance organizations, and politicized Biden-Harris regulators are weaponizing the U.S. regulatory framework governing American financial institutions to inject radical ESG initiatives to the detriment of consumers and our banking system. That's why H.R. 4790 is so essential. It will, 1, prevent regulatory overreach. 2, restore the materiality standard, a key part of this. 3, reform the SEC's proxy voting process. 4, hold large proxy advisory firms accountable. 5, block regulators from injecting ESG initiatives into our financial system. And finally, reassert sovereignty over American financial regulation. So with the Promoting Economic Growth Over Woke Policies Act, House Republicans are taking action to protect the financial system, workers, job creators, and everyday investors from the radical ESG initiatives that put left-wing politics and their goals above the American prosperity. So thank you for allowing me to testify, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Chairman Burgess and Ranking Member McGovern. Even though a government shutdown looms ahead of us, which would cause harm to small businesses, our capital markets, and our economy, here we are instead prioritizing MAGA culture wars at the expense of economic growth and stability. H.R. 4790 is a blatant attempt to deny what most of the world knows is true, that climate change is real and poses real financial risk to the U.S. economy. This bill is also another MAGA attempt to divide America by disparaging rather than celebrating our country's rich diversity. It takes a page right out of Trump's Project 2025 playbook, which aims to restrict the rights of women, minorities, and other historically disenfranchised groups to influence corporate decision-making and denies the significant impact that a diverse workforce and climate risk management can have on a company's bottom line. There is substantial research indicating that companies that embrace climate risk management and hire diverse boards perform better than their similarly situated peers. For example, corporations that are actively managing and planning for climate change, which includes providing public climate-related disclosures, secure an 18% higher return on investment than companies that aren't, and 67% higher than companies who refuse to disclose their emissions. Furthermore, research shows that diverse boards lead to improved financial results. Indeed, companies with the highest percentage of women board directors outperform those with at least about 53% when it comes to shareholder returns. These policies, which are part of a group known as Environmental, Social, and Government, or ESG policies help corporations maximize profits, shareholder value, and grow the overall economy. That's also true that many ESG policies are now commonplace, while requiring companies to have independent directors on their board and policies to treat their workers fairly. So, when Republicans tell you that ESG is bad for business, think again. ESG is good for American investors, good for businesses, and good for workers. H.R. 4790 is a package of several harmful bills that were previously reported out of the House Financial Services Committee without a single Democratic vote. The bills in this package deny climate change and disparage the strength of American diversity from several different angles. First, this bill would restrict the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC's, authority to require public companies disclose important information about their businesses, particularly with regards to environmental, diversity, and other employee-related metrics. It also hampers the SEC's general ability to determine what information investors should have access to in public filings. This provision goes beyond climate risk and diversity disclosures. However, by taking away the SEC's ability to determine in the future what a public company should disclose, and instead hands that responsibility over to the company itself. This would turn 90 years of securities laws, which have contributed to building a capital market that is envied by the rest of the world, on its head. H.R. 4790 would also effectively eliminate shareholders' legal rights to have their proposals included for a vote at a company's annual meeting. Under this provision, companies rather than the SEC would have the final say on what proposals are included for a vote at a company's annual shareholders meeting. As a result, shareholders, who by definition are owners of these public corporations, effectively no longer have a say in how their companies are run. This is despite the storied history shareholder proposals have in promoting key government standards like majority independent boards, board diversity, say on pay, executive compensation, and annual directors' elections. They also allow shareholders to raise other critical issues for management beyond ESG, such as past proposals on the use of child labor in supply chains, the harms of generative AI, in spreading misinformation, and management's accountability related to the opioid crisis. As if it couldn't get worse, not only does this bill give companies the ability to choose what shareholder proposals can and cannot be included for a vote, it also makes it harder for shareholders and their representatives to put forth proposals in general, especially those requiring a company to account for wildfire exposure, hurricanes, and other extreme climate events. This further limits investors' ability to influence the direction and strategy of a public company. Like Division A, Division C of this bill has the potential to limit shareholder input on issues outside the traditional concept of ESG, and could prevent proposals on common sense items like limiting excessive executive compensation or providing benefits and raises for employees. Furthermore, this bill would also gut the proxy advisory industry, which is made up of independent research firms that provide investors with advice and recommendations on how best to vote their shares at a company's annual shareholders meeting. I've put forth 2 amendments to H.R. 4790 that aim to push back on the bad aspects of this bill, which I encourage the committee to make in order. The first expresses a sense of Congress that private funds like venture capital funds can offer grants to minority-owned businesses on account of trends showing they face inordinate barriers to accessing capital. The second would require public companies to disclose whenever they eliminate any employees or offices within the company tasked with enhancing the company's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The final provision I want to discuss is H.R. 4790, is Division D. This section would undermine the ability of the United States government to coordinate internationally, take common sense steps to address financial risk like those posed by climate change. This extreme measure would even make it harder for our bank regulators to encourage banks to expand small business lending. And I would urge you to make my amendment in order that would at least fix that. Mr. Chairman, I think many members on this committee would say they are capitalists and believe in capitalism, but this bill couldn't be more anti-capitalist. It takes away our investors' right, their say in the marketplace, as well as their access to relevant and critical important information, market information. I urge all members to vote no on H.R. 4790, a dangerous bill that would set America's capital markets back to an era where corporate insiders thrived in darkness and without any oversight, and when the enrichment of those at the very top was prioritized to the detriment of everyone else. So I thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back chair. Thanks, Gentlelady. I don't know, Representative Huizinga, you care to respond to anything that you've just heard?
Well, welcome to the Financial Services Committee with exposed rhetoric and all the other things that are going on in the larger political realm. We're seeing it in committee too. And let me just start with this. It's first and foremost, climate change is not even addressed in this. There's no judgment as to whether it's happening or not happening. What it says is simply, is this going to be a material effect on your company? And I will tell you that publicly traded companies in Michigan, we don't have wildfire issues the way that they do in California or in some other states. So that wouldn't necessarily be a material fact for a company in Michigan to report. Now, is it in California? Absolutely. And I would refer back to what the current law says. If you have an issue that is material, you have to file proper forms. And if it's a new issue that comes up, you have to file K-8s and you have to file all these various forms that go in and declare publicly that we have an exposure or we have a risk that had not previously been a part of this. And it ultimately, Mr. Chairman, the watchword here is materiality. I'm a former realtor, and they always used to say in real estate, what are the three most important things about a piece of real estate? Location, location, location. Well, it's the same principle here. Materiality, materiality, and materiality needs to rule the day. What has happened is some on the other side have said that, well, everything is material, therefore we need to report everything. Well, it's just ridiculous. If you are making a computer chip, you are having a very different materiality standard than an energy company. And guess what? Those energy companies already are required to report those things. So what we really see, though, is a defense of an expansion of bureaucratic authority. And these same bureaucrats have been losing at the Supreme Court. They've been losing at lower courts. We are trying to provide some clarity to that. And at the end of the day, if companies could earn more by disclosing material, they would do it. And in fact, their shareholders would require them to do that. They don't. And by the way, many of those funds that claim that they have higher returns are all front-loaded with tech, and they have nothing in any of the other more traditional lanes of investing. And now that tech hasn't been having such a hot day out on the marketplace, all of their returns have gone down, not to mention that they have higher fees, they have higher costs to those investors, all to put up this veneer of, well, we are being more sensitive to these environmental or social or governance issues. And so they don't need regulators to force this information to happen, but that's what we're seeing here is that the SEC has been used, and particularly as a weapon. No, absolutely not. In fact, I've been having a series of conversations with those large asset investors and their management teams, and sometimes the head of those and those that invest into those. And I have said to every single one of them, and this is our policy, speaking on behalf of, and Mr. Norman can inject if he sees me out of bounds at all on this, but I believe every single Republican on the committee would say, if you as an investor, institutional investor, CalPERS, or individual investor, you want to go in and knowingly and in a transparent way say, I'm willing to take a lower return on my investment so that I can feel better about my investment. I don't want to invest in an energy company, or I don't want to invest in X, Y, or Z particular issue. You have the power and the ability to do that voluntarily. What has been happening is the regulators have been forcing that to happen and say, it's obvious and so obvious that we're going to pull that choice away from you. So this charge that somehow this is an anti-investor choice bill is not factual at all. In fact, it would be the opposite, where we are making sure that those companies that have material issues are forced to address them, and there's no way are they prohibited from having them.
For that distinction, I think that's extremely important. Yield to the ranking member for any questions he may have.
I want to associate myself with the remarks of the ranking member, Ms. Waters. I have, do you want to add anything, or?
Oh, yes, if I may, Mr. McGovern, thank you very much. First of all, I am amused by Mr. Huizinga's definition of materiality. He's decided that he's going to decide in this bill what is material and what is not, and I disagree with that strongly. The other thing that bothers me a lot about this legislation is the fact that they are saying that investors cannot help decide what is taken up at a vote, at a yearly meeting. I mean, that is basically destroying what has been substantial with these yearly meetings where investors have an opportunity to include in those meetings. And then if I ever catch California saying that it's willing to lose money and reduce its profits in the way that you have described, I would say that that's illegal. And I would say that that is irresponsible in terms of their fiduciary responsibility. So I don't know where you get all of this from. It just really doesn't make good sense what you're saying. The three ways that I have just mentioned, that these bills really do not make good sense.
Mr. McGovern, yes. if I might, there was actually a lawsuit against CalPERS for that exact reason a few years ago that was settled. There was an investor, a retired group, that sued CalPERS that they were taking a lower rate based on their investing decisions. Now, again, if you want to do that voluntarily, go ahead. You can do that either as an institutional investor or as an individual. I don't think they're necessarily wanting to have a lower return. I do know that a lot of the claims of a higher return if you vote in or if you invest in an ESG fund have turned out to be false. The costs, the fees are higher, the administration is higher, and the return, once tech stocks started tanking or not performing to their utmost, they started to diminish. So those are facts that have happened. And I know this is your time. If you don't mind, I'd like to just point out one other thing. There is no prohibition on shareholders making a proposal. As had been the law and the tradition, the SEC would review these and say, this is material and this is not a material issue. And they would say, corporation, you don't have to vote, you don't have to take a vote on the non-material issue that has been proposed. Some of what we have talked about is having a threshold. Most recently, in fact, just last week, things fly by here a little quickly. So just last week, we had a hearing in committee where the treasurer of Illinois was testifying in front of us. And he had just written an article about how the voice of the majority are not going to be silenced. And he was fighting against the Exxon Corporation. There was Exxon and Adjournment Capital had a lawsuit. And there was a proposal that had been proposed by Adjournment that was lost with 72.9%. Now, they came back the next year trying to make their case, and they lost 89.5%. This is a perfect example where the SEC can come in and say, your issue is not having traction and clearly is not being recognized by the investors as a material issue. Therefore, you don't have to take it up for a third year where maybe it would get beat 90-10. So that's the kind of thing that wastes massive amounts of time and money for these publicly traded companies, which again, most of the time have investors that are institutional investors, that's our constituents, retirement funds and things like that. And we know that it's just made it more difficult for many of those managers.
Well, I don't have any further questions. I have a feeling that this is not going to become law, so I will yield back my time.
Chair, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back to the gentlelady from Minnesota. Is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just have a couple of comments. I just want to thank you for making it clear, Mr. Hangsinger, that it says nothing about climate change, because that's not what the bill is about. And just you had a lot of explanation, and I just want to make sure, just kind of drill it down. Is there anything in the bill that would prevent a company from disclosing ESG information, particularly if it was requested?
Yeah, no, nothing. We have 20 bills that have been rolled up into this one particular package, and nothing would prohibit a publicly traded company from voluntarily putting information out there. They can do that if they think it's in their best interest, or even if they want to just mollify and placate or address concerns that shareholders have. What the current situation is the flip side of that coin, which is currently they are being forced to put this information out that they don't want to, or that is not material, because when you are preparing for these annual shareholder meetings, we probably all have received some sort of proxy form at some point. That's another big issue that we got to get into. But we've all seen these things, right? I mean, these have to be printed, they're distributed, everyone has to have the option. What the SEC's traditional role was and this is under both Republicans and Democrats in the White House and the head of the SEC, they would go through and say, this issue is not material. You don't have to take a vote on this. This one absolutely is. You do need to take a vote on that.
And then just one more question. Is there anything in this legislation that would force someone to invest their own money in a company that doesn't disclose their ESG information?
No.
All right. Thank you very much. That's all. I just wanted to make sure that we all understood what was actually in the legislation. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks to gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back to gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was struck by something the ranking member said about the fact that the restrictions in this bill are almost anti-capitalism. I don't think anyone can really believe that corporations decided to engage in ESG operations because they deliberately were trying to be less profitable or something. My assumption is they were responding to market forces, and in that manner, this is a result of capitalism. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about an investment group in my district, the Sisters of St. Francis, who are very engaged investors, and they do seek information from the companies they invest in on things including human rights, labor rights, tobacco, the environment, impact on hunger, impact on health, and impact on gun safety. So if we have investors in the community who are interested in knowing about the social impacts of the companies they're investing in, how would this bill impact those investors?
Well, that's precisely what the bill is intended to do, is to keep those voices out so that they don't have an opinion, don't have advocacy that would cause maybe other voters to agree with them. This is all about shutting down the investors who would come to, these yearly meetings or so, and have something they would want to say, particularly about ESG. Look, I mean, it's very interesting the way Mr. Hajinga talks about who does not have wildfires. This is America. We're not talking about what's good for some in these United States and what we don't care about in other parts of the country. This is about climate change, which is an international issue, and it certainly is a national issue. And because they're not like California, who have wildfires, he didn't say whether or not they have storms. He didn't say whether or not the heat is, in the 3-digit measure. He didn't say any of that. He just tried to make you believe that some states don't even have to worry about some of these so-called issues. And so I am a little bit surprised about that because, again, I say this is America. This is all of our country that's involved in these issues, maybe one way or the other. And maybe we don't have wildfires in Michigan or someplace, but I don't know. They could have thunderstorms with, storms where you have, all kind of destruction going on. Well, overall, whether we're talking about investors who are being limited in the right to have a say and to have an influence because they're invested, or whether or not it is those who don't believe in science and they don't believe in, anything that we're saying about climate change and don't want ESG to be a part of what they care about in the way that they disclose information. This is just a terrible bill, and this is a terrible way for those of us who care about this country, who care about the safety and security, and we're sensible enough to think about the future and what is happening based on what we see every day. We have cities now where seniors in particular and others are dying from heat. We do have wildfires that are burning up whole communities, and on and on and on. And so when we take on legislation like this, simply because we have one more vote than the other side, it reminds me of some of the other things that I see going on the opposite side of the aisle. And I just wonder whether or not this movement to use their power basically undermines what the real Republican Party used to be about. The real Republican Party, not the MAGA Republican Party. The real Republican Party really did talk about, in essence, the entire country and not divide it up in ways that we don't need what you need and we don't need protections like you need protections. I'm amazed at all of this. And so all I can say to you is, in the several ways that this bill has approached diversity, inclusion, investor protection, fiduciary responsibility, all of that, it throws everything out the window.
Well, I'd have to agree with you that the wildfires example is a particularly poor one, especially if we think back to last summer or the summer before, when the air quality in Philadelphia, which I represent, here in DC, was so poor because of Canadian wildfires. So you're right, it absolutely is a global impact and something that we see here, even though we don't have wildfires physically in the District of Columbia or in Philadelphia. I do take your point. There are a lot of faith communities in my district. I mentioned the Sisters of St. Francis. We have the Quakers. We have a number of our mainstream Protestant organizations that are investing based upon the types of considerations that are being deemed ESG and not part of what would be acceptable under this bill. So I would have to oppose it on that ground alone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I was going to yield back. Is there something you'd like to add?
Well, I would just, again, underscore the Sisters of St. Francis, or in my area, which is filled with a number of faith-based organizations like that, they're not prohibited from investing the way that they want to invest. The question is, and I don't know the exact profile of the Sisters of St. Francis investment portfolio. What we do know, so I'm not trying to call them out specifically, but we do know that there are investors, oftentimes called activist investors, that are going in and they are buying an infinitesimal amount of shares so that they can go in and try to force an issue for a company. And the question is, if you have a fiduciary legal responsibility to maximize return, are you going to allow something like that to go through? And I'll use my example with the Illinois the treasurer and the Exxon situation, where we saw 80% plus reject something. The question is are you going to go back year after year after year after year to retread that same ground? And what does that do cost-wise that impacts the return for investors that are in there? So that I just wanted to underscore again, there is nothing that prohibits them from investing the way that they want to invest. I will note that there's been $40 billion pulled out of ESG funds in this past year alone. Why? Because of the return issue, that not being where it needs to be.
I guess I would argue that some of the money's been pulled out because of the congressional attacks on ESG funds, but I do think this bill poses some really serious issues with respect to the transparency that investors would like to have. And so, again, for that reason, I would oppose it. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. I would just note the state of Texas with several of their, like the Texas Teachers Retirement Fund, has decided they'd had enough of the ESG type investing and they needed a reasonable return for their retired teachers. Recognize the gentleman from South Carolina for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Huizenga, for leading the charge on this. How in the world are financial regulators climate regulators?
We have asked that question in committee many, many times. We have asked the SEC how many climate experts they have on staff. We've asked that of Treasury, of the Fed, of FDIC, of everybody that has been injected into this. Representative Scanlon had brought up, I believe it was her, I'm not trying to put words in her mouth, but talking about the regulators and not necessarily overstepping their bounds, that they're just going through with common sense, these are my words, common sense sort of things that should be disclosed. If you look at what happened with the SEC's climate disclosure rule, you cannot get more descriptive than that. The SEC proposed a rule that would not just apply or have an effect on publicly traded companies. There's something that it was going down all the way down to the suppliers of material that would go to a publicly traded company, needing to report their again, these are privately held companies, report their climate impact. The example I gave, and I use this in committee as well, is I used to represent Gerber Baby Food in Fremont, Michigan, owned by Nestle Corporation, publicly traded company. So Nestle and that owners would fall under this climate disclosure. Now what would happen is they would have to force all of their suppliers to look at what their carbon footprint would be. And by the way, that's not an easy one. When I talked to actually one of the farmers up there, he said, I am the compliance department. And he said, we struggle to make sure that we can supply the documentation between organic and non-organic, much less if we had to go in and track what type of tractor we are using, how many gallons per acre are we using of a particular pesticide or a particular fuel consumption? How did the produce get delivered to said company? I mean, it became such a thicket, even the SEC decided to abandon it. And that's what we're seeing, and that's the point that many of us have, is you've taken good intentions and have expanded it so far that you've made it unworkable. And we all know this in this job. Sometimes when you have so much information, the information you received is basically worthless. You are better off getting relevant material information on whatever issue that you are dealing with. And we've seen this time and time and time again, where investors have just been flooded with information that they don't want and they don't need as they make those investing decisions.
Don't you think the ones that would voice an opinion would be the shareholders?
Yeah.
If they really needed something, they would voice their opinion. We want to see that.
Yes. Ultimately, that is the idea of a publicly traded company, is you have, instead of a privately traded company, you've got those shareholders who are investing and they are looking for a return. And we still have lots of regulation. This is not an absence of regulation or absence of reporting. If this bill goes through, it's not like the SEC disappears. It's not like there's no reporting in all of these things. What it starts doing is putting guardrails on what these bureaucrats and regulators can force a publicly traded company to do, and it all centers in on materiality.
It's got a cost to it too, doesn't it?
It's a massive cost to continue the way that we have. There's over 50 rules that are either in process or have been finalized by the SEC in the last 3 years. 50 rules. And that has stymied where companies are trying to spend millions of dollars and countless hours trying to wade through that, figuring out what the impacts are going to be.
Yeah, and you take something like the climate regulations, you're talking about interpretation, you're talking about a cost to try to figure that out. It's impossible. And financial regulators are not climate regulators. They're just not. And they can't propose to be that. If you and I built a project, our customers would tell us what they wanted, not the mandates. Now, before you got here, Mr. McGovern was saying, I think we as I don't know whether he was talking about us on the Rules Committee, didn't know what woke was. Give me some examples of your definition of woke that's been imposed on the businesses.
I think ultimately in this particular circumstance, it is putting social goals above investing goals.
Give me an example.
Well, it could be forcing a company to disclose who they do their donations to.
What about gender-neutral bathrooms? That would be a woke policy.
It could be that.
What about pronoun badges? That would be a woke policy.
And again, I just want to make a distinction. If a company wants to voluntarily do that,
right,
that's fine. Go ahead, knock yourself out. But when you have regulators coming in saying, no, you must do this, that's where it crosses the line.
And the SEC has crossed that line in so many things they're demanding now.
Countless times. And I want to point out, you've seen maybe the subtle shift. The subtle shift from this is good for the economy and we get better return and all those arguments that we hear, to when now it's, well, this is an existential threat. And that forces the government to use its power and force this onto investors so that it's going to be good for them whether they know it or not.
Thank you for leading the charge on this. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Chair. Thanks, gentlemen. The gentlelady from New Mexico is now recognized for questions.
Thank you very much. And, you know, when I just look at this title, Prioritizing Economic Growth Over Woke Policies Act, woke policies. I mean, clearly that is not a financial term. Clearly, this bill is a messaging bill. This bill is really not serious. And I just want to give the ranking member, do you want to address any other matters in this bill? I will say it sort of reminds me a bit of like those monkeys, don't want to see, don't want to hear, don't want to speak. Like they do not want to know about the economic impact of climate change, of some of these things that are hitting us. And as an example, in New Mexico, we had drastic wildfires. As an example, across this country, there are wildfires, there are 100-year floods coming twice a week, there were hurricanes, there are tornadoes. And as a result, we are having a hard time getting insurers to insure, companies to insure, buildings to insure the Santa Fe Opera. The Santa Fe Opera can't get insurance. These are issues that impact businesses, that impact shareholders. Is there anything you want to say in closing, Ranking Member?
First of all, Mr. Norman talked about the cost of policies that would be involved with ESG. What he does not talk about is whatever the costs are, does not stop these major corporations from paying millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to the CEOs and others in the C-suite. They don't seem to be taking a loss at all. Whatever it is you think may be costing the corporation a lot more money and should not be enforced upon them, why don't you include in that, well, but let me admit that the CEOs and the C-suite is doing well. As a matter of fact, their compensation is being raised all the time. The other thing is this. When you talk, yes, please go right ahead. I'll yell.
Congressman Waters, as far as executive...
Actually, it's my time. You need to ask
Oh,
me.
that's
Well,
right.
I'm sorry.
It's her time. That's right.
But since Ranking Member suggested that you could ask her a question, go right ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Leger Fernandez. Do you not think that as an individual investor, you've got the choice to invest in a company that pays a CEO whatever they do when you look it up? You can object to investing and take your money elsewhere. The same way on a college football coach. You can go pay for the Alumni Association, but if you object to what they pay them, you can voice your opinion and take your money somewhere else. How is that not free enterprise?
Well, it is freedom, but what you do not talk about is what the changes are. Oftentimes, when a CEO leaves and they're desperate to steal a CEO from another company, they raise the amount of compensation. And this happened after the investments have been done. And the investors have a right to oppose that. They have a right to come in and say, let's take this up as an issue. I do not think that this new CEO that you just hired should make millions more than the past CEO. So don't just limit it to you either can or you can't. There are circumstances that occur in business which causes one to have to look at various aspects of that business in different ways. And let me also remind you that as we're in the international, worldwide trading business, that you may have materials that are coming in, that are being purchased, that are being invested in, certain kinds of woods that are constructed and made up in such a way that they have harmful materials in the manufacturing of them. And those materials could get into the problem that investors would have by saying, look, we paid out all of this money because the materials that you purchased were dangerous. And you didn't disclose it. You didn't let us know that. You got it on the cheap. And so there's so many things to be considered. And don't laugh at those who are trying very hard to make this a safe place for all of us. You know, we have people are dying from preventable diseases caused by what's going on in the environment. And of course, I won't talk about the fires and the hurricanes and all of the rest of that. But all of this is about the growing scientific information and knowledge that we have access to that would help to make a better lifestyle and the possibility of longer life for all of us. And so this is serious business. I thank you, Mr. Norman, and you ought to yield back.
I reclaim my time. You done, Mr. Norman? With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back the chair. Chair thanks the gentlelady. I hope we can continue this particular discussion when we deal with high fructose corn syrup in the Farm Bill. But that's a subject for another day. Seeing no other members wishing to ask questions of this panel, I want to thank you for your thoughtful comments, and this panel is excused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I would like to welcome our third panel, Representative Biggs from Arizona, Ranking Member Nadler from New York, both from the Committee on Judiciary. I welcome you to the witness table. And as we complete the transition and everyone gets settled, Representative Biggs, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all the members of the committee. Today, I'm here to testify about H.R. 5717, the No Bailout for Sanctuary Cities Act, and H.R. 7909, the Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act. In 3.5 years, President Joe Biden and border czar Vice President Kamala Harris have allowed more than 8.2 million unvetted illegal aliens into the United States. At the same time that they facilitated the collapse of our southwest border, President Biden and Vice President Harris have abandoned any semblance of interior immigration enforcement. In a September 2021 memo, the Biden-Harris administration made enforcement more difficult for immigration and customs enforcement officers. In training materials obtained by the Judiciary Committee and published in a staff report earlier this year, DHS failed to answer seemingly clear-cut questions such as whether an alien who served a 20-year drug-related prison sentence or an alien who discharged a firearm outside a police station should be priorities for arrest and deportation. Those are the training materials required for all of ICE's enforcement personnel nationwide. And instead of making clear that ICE officers should carry out their duties to remove criminal aliens from American streets, the Biden-Harris administration instructs ICE officers to develop a full profile of a criminal alien before deciding whether to arrest someone who is in the country illegally. In the training examples that include determining whether the illegal alien has high blood pressure or is a caregiver, the Biden-Harris administration's immigration absurdity apparently knows no bounds. In an interview with the Judiciary Committee, a former top ICE official admitted that the Biden-Harris administration's policies have made immigration enforcement more dangerous for ICE officers, more difficult to carry out, and less efficient overall. It's easier to catch someone and detain them at the border than try to track them down once they've been released into the United States. The ICE official even acknowledged that because of the border crisis, fewer ICE officers are available to track down public safety and national security threats because they're left to do border-related tasks. But this shouldn't be a surprise. In 2019, Kamala Harris told the ACLU she would slash funding for immigration detention, close private immigration detention centers, and even use taxpayer funding to provide transgender surgeries for illegal aliens detained in the United States. Here's how our policies are working out. In fiscal year 2019, the Trump administration arrested aliens who accounted for 5,435 convictions and charges for family offenses. That number dropped to a mere 3,439 in fiscal year 2023 under the Biden-Harris team. That's a 36.7% decrease. In fiscal year 2019, ICE arrested aliens who were responsible for 6,650 sex offenses and 5,061 sexual assault offenses. Under the Biden administration, in fiscal year 2023, ICE arrested aliens responsible for only 5,746 sex offenses and 4,390 sexual assault offenses. Again, drops of 13% in each category. All the while, the number of illegal aliens is almost apples to oranges for the 2019's comparisons to 2023, which had an exponential growth in the total number of illegal aliens brought in. These are not hypotheticals or simply just numbers. They're reality for families across the country. And they're emblematic of the Biden-Harris administration's war on women. Just last week, the Judiciary Committee heard from 3 moms whose daughters were brutally assaulted and murdered by illegal aliens welcomed into the country by President Biden and Vice President Harris. These are not isolated incidents. In February, an illegal alien was arrested in Alabama for allegedly raping a 14-year-old girl who could not consent to the intercourse as she was physically helpless or mentally incapacitated. In April, an illegal alien was arrested in Indiana for allegedly breaking into a Michigan mobile home park and sexually assaulting 2 young girls. In May, authorities arrested a 27-year-old illegal alien for allegedly snatching an 11-year-old girl off the street in front of her Lake Worth, Florida home and sexually assaulting her. According to local officials, the Guatemalan national crossed the U.S.-Mexico border in early January, made his way to Florida shortly after, and does not have an immigration court date until 2027. That is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's immigration legacy. More unvetted aliens released into American communities, more criminal aliens on American streets, more Americans endangered by radical, reckless policies. Kamala Harris's war on women is fueled by her open borders policy, which allow more sexual offenders, domestic violence offenders, and child abusers not only into the country, but also to remain in the country indefinitely, free from fear of deportation. The American people can end this nightmare in just 2 months if voters choose to end this crisis. Republicans have proposed new laws that will allow the next president to secure the border and increase interior immigration enforcement on day one, and H.R. 7909 is just one of many of those bills. H.R. 7909 is the Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act, and it makes crystal clear that illegal aliens who commit sex offenses are inadmissible to and removable from the United States. The bill also fixes a discrepancy in current immigration law by creating a ground of inadmissibility for domestic violence to mirror the existing ground of removability for the same offenses. In addition, the bill expands the current ground of inadmissibility for domestic violence by cross-referencing an existing statutory definition for sex offenses. Although many aliens can already be found inadmissible to and removable from the United States for certain sex offenses and domestic violence offenses, H.R. 7909 expands and clarifies the conduct for which an alien can be found removable from the country. The time is now to take seriously the danger of criminal aliens in the United States. Anything that makes it easier for adjudicators and officials to ensure criminal aliens' arrest and removal should receive overwhelming bipartisan support, particularly when it comes to sex offenses and domestic violences. The other important bill I'm here today to discuss is H.R. 5717, the No Bailout for Sanctuary Cities Act. Time and time again, cities and localities across this country release dangerous criminal aliens back into American streets because these jurisdictions refuse to cooperate with federal immigration officials. Although current law already prohibits jurisdictions from refusing to cooperate with federal immigration officials, states, cities, and localities continue to enact their sanctuary policies anyway. This bill provides an enforcement mechanism for the federal government. We had a judiciary field hearing just 2 weeks ago in San Diego, and a sheriff came and talked about how he is hampered in enforcing local laws when he knows he cannot communicate the acts of a criminal that they have arrested with ICE, and instead they have to release them for their sanctuary city policies, their sanctuary state policies, excuse me. The consequences of sanctuary policies will shock you. Earlier this year, ICE finally arrested a Honduran national charged with sex crimes against a child after authorities in Northern Virginia refused to honor an ICE detainer on multiple occasions. Instead, Northern Virginia officials released the alleged child abuser back onto American streets. 2019, the Chicago Police Department refused to honor an ICE detainer for a Mexican national who had been arrested for theft. After his release from custody, the illegal alien allegedly lured a 3-year-old girl into a McDonald's bathroom and sexually assaulted her. Had Chicago authorities cooperated with federal officials, the man, a convicted aggravated felon who previously had been deported, could have been in ICE custody and removed from the country. That release was not an isolated incident. According to ICE, Cook County, Illinois law enforcement released 1,070 criminal aliens and immigration violators in fiscal year 2019, despite requests by ICE to notify the agency before their release from local custody. New York City also continues its sanctuary city policies despite rampant crime, including crimes that would have been prevented by cooperating with ICE. In 2020, ICE immigration enforcement activity led to 54 arrests of aliens with criminal charges such as sexual assault against a child, lewd and lascivious acts upon a child, robbery, and grand larceny. Of the 54 aliens arrested, more than 30 were released from local law enforcement custody despite an active ICE detainer. Those releases have tragic consequences. In 2020, an illegal alien allegedly raped and murdered a 92-year-old woman in Queens, New York, despite ICE requesting that local law enforcement hand him over to federal authorities after an arrest just 2 months before the rape. New York City's released him. In January 2023, a 27-year-old illegal alien from Mexico was sentenced to multiple life sentences for murdering 3 people. The man who was allowed to remain in the United States through DACA was arrested for domestic violence in New Jersey in 2017. Local law enforcement ignored an ICE detainer and released him, where a year later he murdered his girlfriend and a married couple. If these jurisdictions simply picked up the phone and communicated with ICE, these tragedies could have been avoided. But those sanctuary jurisdictions have simply taken a page out of Vice President Harris's policy playbook. In 2019, Kamala Harris committed to ending ICE detainers, a key law enforcement tool used to ensure that dangerous illegal aliens with criminal histories are not set free on American streets. Vice President Harris has repeatedly donated to an organization that promoted sanctuary city policies. Coupled with the Biden-Harris border crisis, Democrats' sanctuary jurisdiction policies have been a nightmare for Americans. With H.R. 5717, the No Bailout for Sanctuary Cities Act, those policies can end. H.R. 5717 ensures that Americans will not foot the bill for illiberal jurisdictions' radical and unsafe sanctuary policies. The bill renders sanctuary jurisdictions ineligible to receive certain taxpayer dollars that would bankroll illegal immigration in American communities. By precluding certain federal funding to jurisdictions that prohibit or restrict their cooperation with federal immigration officials, the bill encourages sanctuary jurisdictions to end their anti-enforcement policies in favor of working with the Department of Homeland Security. H.R. 5717 renews jurisdictions' urgency to cooperate with federal immigration officials to ensure safer streets for every American. And that should be a goal with every member here today. Today, my colleagues from across the aisle will present far-fetched hypotheticals about how Republicans want to strip funding from program after program. That is an unfounded argument. It is a red herring. It is deflection. To continue receiving certain federal funding, all these jurisdictions have to do is simply follow existing law. If Democrats choose to prioritize criminal aliens over their own residents and U.S. citizens, then that is a choice they'll have to answer for at the ballot box. It is absurd that a bill like this is even necessary, but as we have seen time and time again, far-left jurisdictions prefer to release dangerous criminal aliens back onto American streets rather than complying with existing federal law. This bill helps end that absurdity. Mr. Chairman and members, I thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. The gentleman from New York is now recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, most of what Mr. Biggs said, the first half of his statement before he started speaking specifically about these 2 bills, is either irrelevant or incorrect. The illegal aliens who allegedly committed these crimes may indeed have committed these crimes. But FBI statistics clearly show that native-born Americans commit crimes of violence, and in fact all crimes, at a rate higher than do migrants, whether legal migrants or illegal migrants. As to these 2 bills, the bills we are considering today suffer from the same fundamental flaw. Both would do tremendous damage to the people they are supposedly intended to help. First, we have H.R. 5717, the No Bailout for Sanctuary Cities Act. This bill is being rushed to the floor without following regular order. It wasn't considered in committee. And given how poorly written this bill is, it is clear why its supporters might have wanted to shield it from greater scrutiny. This bill prevents so-called sanctuary jurisdictions, in some cases entire states, from receiving any federal funds that might, quote, benefit, unquote, undocumented immigrants. This would result in drastic cuts to education, transportation, law enforcement, and health care, among other needed services. Cuts that would devastate all of the state's residents. States targeted under this legislation include not only blue states like New York, California, and Illinois, but also Republican strongholds like Utah and North Dakota. Let's think what this bill would mean for our constituents. Local police protect the public. They do not check a person's immigration status when responding to a call for help or answering a 911 call. Similarly, states are required by law to provide K-12 students with public education, regardless of immigration status. and no one has to prove their immigration status before using bridges, roads, or pedestrian walkways. All of these services go in some part to, quote, benefit, unquote, undocumented immigrants. So as a result, under this bill, state and local police forces will lose millions of dollars in burn JAG grants from the Department of Justice and billions more in transportation and education funding. I could go on and on. Why the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lalota, would choose to sponsor a bill that would slash federal funding to our state of New York and to the states of so many of his Republican colleagues is beyond me. Supporters of the bill will argue that we are reading the bill too broadly, but they cannot hide behind sloppy drafting. This concept is straight out of Project 2025, which specifically calls on a future Trump administration to try to coerce states and localities into adopting anti-immigrant policies by withholding federal funds. Republicans use the term sanctuary city the same way that Donald Trump tells stories about immigrants eating cats and dogs. They want their constituents to be afraid of immigrants and to imply that some cities harbor criminals and refuse to comply with federal law. The truth is that in some cities, gaining the trust of immigrant communities is a key component of good policing. And you may disagree, but the answer is not to cut billions of dollars away from those states and localities. This is a dangerously overbroad bill, and members should reject it. The other bill, H.R. 7909, is also overly broad and will hurt the very population it claims to protect. Sexual offenses and domestic violence are serious crimes, and if this bill fixed some gap in current law, I would have no problem supporting it. But instead, parts of the bill are almost entirely redundant to current law, while others would result in extremely harsh and unintended consequences, including the removal of survivors of domestic violence. This legislation purports to add new grounds of inadmissibility and deportability for sexual offenses, adds a new ground of inadmissibility for domestic violence and other related offenses, and expands the current grounds for deportability for domestic violence. This bill is so redundant to current law that virtually no additional dangerous individuals would face immigration consequences. However, this bill attempts to significantly expand the definition of domestic violence to include the Violence Against Women Act definition that is used for grants and funding. This is a much broader definition that was never meant to be used in criminal law. We know that because the definition explicitly says that it covers conduct, quote, that may or may not constitute criminal behavior. And yet this bill would make that criminal behavior. This broader VAWA-based definition sweeps in behaviors that domestic violence organizations say will implicate survivors who have used violence in self-defense or who were accused by their abusers and were either unable to defend themselves or pled guilty to avoid having to go through the court process. The bill will also make it less likely that immigrant communities will report incidents of domestic violence. The bottom line is that this bill will set back our efforts to protect survivors. And over 200 national and local groups participating in the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence oppose this legislation. We need to work together to solve our immigration problems, but these two bills take us in the wrong direction. My Republican colleagues may think that their anti-immigrant rhetoric has no impact, but sadly we can see in Springfield, Ohio and elsewhere that these attacks can set off a deadly chain reaction. I urge my colleagues to go back to the drawing board with these misguided bills, and I look forward to your questions.
Sure, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Biggs, I would just ask you, is there anything you'd like to respond to in the ranking member's opening statements?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll briefly address one of the arguments that he's made multiple times, both on different bills over time, and is that citizens and those lawfully present in the country commit more crimes. Well, I would hope so. Of course they commit more crimes. There's 320 million of them, whatever. But the nub of it ultimately comes down to this. If you have a new pool of 8 to 10 million people, and some estimate higher, and even if 1, 5, 10%, whatever they are, whatever that percentage is committing violent crime against individuals, you have that many more people in here committing those crimes, which otherwise they wouldn't be here to commit. And thus, you actually make the communities less safe. And this bill kind of gets at that. But when the gentleman says we should work together to solve these problems, you can't solve a problem if you don't acknowledge that it is a problem. And so far, so many across the aisle have refused to even acknowledge that there's a crisis on the border. We had the field hearing in San Diego Judiciary Committee. There weren't any of my colleagues from across the aisle there. And we heard victims, those who have been suffered because of the problems. We heard law enforcement, we heard business people, we heard moms, we heard the mom of a kid who rides a school bus, and a group of 20 illegal aliens were trying to get on that school bus, whether innocently or not, and I don't know, but the point is, this affects all of our communities, and sanctuary city policies that California openly acknowledges that it has, they're not imagination, and they're not bringing order and safety to California, and it's actually quite the contrary. And so that's what I would say, Mr. Chairman.
It's almost like it cries out for a border czar.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Ranking Member.
Mr. Chairman, let me just say that there is indeed a problem. There's no question it's a problem. And of course, in the Senate, they negotiated a very severe bill with the second most conservative member of the Senate, Lankford, and that would have gone a long way towards solving the problem, but the former president, President Trump, said, tank the bill because I want to run on a problem. I don't want the solution. The second thing is...
I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Can you give me the House number of that bill?
No,
Was that bill introduced in the United States House of Representatives? People accuse me of blocking it all the time.
I didn't
What
accuse
was
you
the
of
bill
blocking
number?
it. I don't know. And
There was no bill number. It never was introduced in the House of Representatives.
That may be, but it was tanked before it ever got out of the Senate.
And that's nonsense too, and you know that. That was a terrible bill that was discussed over the United States Senate. What was they actually set a floor. There would be at least 5,000 illegal contacts every day before they would do anything, before even the minimum. So don't lecture me about that bill. That bill was dead on arrival because it was a bad bill, not because a former president said anything about it. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you're exactly right. And actually, Mr. Langford later recanted on the bill. And by the way, the other party controls that body. They could have done that. Now, let's talk about that. You're right. It was 5,000 touches or encounters every day before the president could, not mandated, but could declare an emergency. It wasn't until there were 7,500 encounters that the president was required to declare an emergency. And there were 40 separate exemptions to whatever emergency that he could enact. Things like unaccompanied minors, specific jurisdictions, collective parolees, those types of things. Yes, and when you think 7,500 before the president has to act, man, that's 240, 250,000 a month. And I would just tell you, Mr. Burgess, that would be on the upper end of the high scale ever. And as you know, Mr. Chairman, and I was going to say this, but I'll just give it to you. So in 2020, last year of the previous administration, Yuma sector, you know what the total encounters were? Fewer than 8,600 for a whole year. For a whole year. For the Tucson sector, they averaged for the last 3 years of the last administration 60,000 encounters in that border for years. You know what? Now it takes about we're off the high in Yuma County, sector for Pete's sakes, but it still takes about 6 weeks to do what they did in a full year. That's all. It just takes 6 weeks. And the Tucson sector is being overrun now because Texas is actually trying to do something on the border, so they're moving our way. And that's really what's happening. And that was not a good bill. The good bill that we did was H.R. 2.
Correct.
That would have been a good bill.
And it's still a good bill. It still could be enacted by the Senate. They could take it up tomorrow. And of course, the president had the ability. He didn't need the 5,000 or 7,500 touches under Section 212F of the immigration law. He could stop it today, and he won't do it. And again, the situation just cries out for a border czar.
Mr. Chairman, it was my fault for addressing Mr. Biggs's extraneous comments. We ought to talk about these two bills.
Yeah, well, let's talk about these two bills. Most people can't understand that it's not already, I mean, inadmissibility and removability for violent offenders. I mean, that actually does seem like common sense. Most people wouldn't question your reasoning with bringing this bill before us today.
Two bills.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, there was a letter written by DHS Secretary, a memo put out in August of 2021, where they kind of defined that you were not going to actually remove everyone who has a violent problem with violence. You're not going to do that. We're going to actually assess whether we keep them there. And that's part of our problem. There is no ability to vet people, so they're just releasing people. And so both of these are actually fairly common sense. I would have thought. I'm kind of surprised that the opposition is so vehement here. But I mean, most people think that if you have committed a violent crime anywhere, whether before you got here or after you got here, you should not be allowed to be here if you're in this country illegally. So that's really number one. Number two, we actually provide exemptions if you were a victim of domestic violence under the INA. We're going to provide you an exemption from when you would otherwise be inadmissible and be removable. We're going to provide you with an ability to stay here. But what this bill does, it says, look, if you are the perpetrator of these kind of activities, you should not be allowed to be here. And I just thought, you know, those actually seem fairly straightforward, probably as straightforward as, you know, I'm in the two most contentious committees in the Congress, in the Judiciary and Oversight. These two bills I actually thought we'd probably see eye to eye on. I'm kind of surprised.
So if you had a president and a vice president who actually cared about the American people, I think that would be true. But, I mean, what is the effect of taking a community of 60,000 and saying, now we're going to place 20,000 more people in your community and not provide you any protections or any additional funding? That was a recipe for disaster, and they got their wish.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, to that point, since you live on a border state, I live in a border state, and you get down to the border, and you can see, if, for instance, in Yuma, they're the #1 producer of leafy green vegetables for North America in the winter months.
And we thank you.
Yeah, about 6-7 months out of the year. What happens is because there's so many people, they get released into the country, and Yuma, they were doing street releases. And these types of vegetables are incredibly sensitive, and they have to monitor them. But if you don't know what's going on, you go in and just traipse through a field. They have to burn up that field of vegetables. And that happens over and over again because of the rampant illegal migration that's taken place. And that comes because of incentives to come into the country. And these two bills would at least disincentivize some people from coming into the country and provide greater safety for the United States.
Yes, Mr. Ranking Member, you had
These two bills would disincentivize nobody. Let's take a look at the one bill. People are already inadmissible, and the bill is so redundant to current law that virtually no additional dangerous individuals would face immigration consequences, but it would adopt the VAWA definition of violence against women. But VAWA says that may or may not constitute criminal behavior.
But that is pretty preposterous, isn't it? That is pretty preposterous that when you use the Democrats' own language, own definition of violence against women in your bill.
But the definition is not supposed to be used for criminal behavior.
Yeah, explain that to the poor woman who's being victimized.
And it is broader VAWA-based definition would sweep in behavior that domestic violence organizations say will implicate survivors who have used violence in self-defense. So if you, well, I don't mean, if someone, I don't mean you, Mr. Chairman, if someone abused their wife and their wife used violence in self-defense, this language would make the wife deportable. The other bill, which gets at sanctuary cities or sanctuary states actually, would make, says that no services may be given, no funds that may, says that these jurisdictions cannot receive funds that might benefit undocumented immigrants. All funds may benefit undocumented immigrants. Roads, hospitals, schools, police, all may benefit undocumented individuals. So what this bill says is that states like New York and California and Illinois and Utah and North Dakota could get no federal funds for any purpose. That makes no sense.
I don't know. In the state of Texas, we now do require hospitals to inquire as to immigration status. But look, I know we need to get on to other members who have questions. Mr. Biggs, you used the term unfounded argument in your discussion, and unfortunately, Mr. McGovern is no longer here. But since you brought it up again, Mr. Nadler, the situation in Springfield, Ohio, I want to put into the record an article from NPR, not necessarily a right-leaning organization, but the threats that were, and this is dated September 17th, so it's current. The threats that were coming into the community were from overseas. They were not from Republicans in Texas or Arizona or even Minnesota. They're from overseas. And I think it's important, we already had a discussion between the ranking member and the gentlelady from Minnesota about perhaps not accusing people who you should not be accusing. I would like to ask unanimous consent that this be part of the record without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, wherever the threats may be coming from, overseas or wherever, maybe not only overseas, but overseas, the threats are coming because the former president and Senator Vance have lied about immigrants, illegal immigrants, eating pets in Springfield. First of all, the Haitians in Springfield are legal immigrants. Second of all, nobody's eating pets. The Republican mayor of Springfield, the Republican governor of Ohio, Governor Devine, have said none of this is true. Senator Vance said on Meet the Press on Sunday, I saw him say it, he said, to get the story out, you sometimes have to make things up.
Governor DeWine called upon the federal government to do more to help cities like Springfield.
Well, the federal
problem
government
is
ought to do more.
the federal government put those individuals in his city and did not provide the resources.
But the problem is caused in the first place by Trump and Vance lying about what's going on there.
Was placing 20,000 people in his community that was not prepared for what was coming their way.
The mayor and the governor have both said, the Republican mayor and the governor and the Republican governor have both said that the people there are taking up, are performing jobs that are useful for the local economy, and they have greatly helped the local economy. Governor DeWine said that. Mayor, I forget his name, of Springfield said that.
Did you have?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just want to add that not only did Governor DeWine point out where all 33 of the bomb scares came from, that they were from out of the United States, he's described them appropriately as hoaxes, that there was nothing there, obviously. And so, I mean, now we've really digressed, away from these two bills. Because what these two bills get at is to solve, because we have to solve a problem that was caused when this administration came in and President Joe Biden, within 72 hours, had issued a massive number of executive orders undoing the border control that was in place, that we had a pretty safe and pretty secure border, perhaps in my lifetime, the most secure border. But once all those executive orders came in, when we got this massive inflow of people, and we don't vet them. We do things like, collective or mass parole, things that had not been done before, and that's what they've done. And so I get there, regardless of what you think about what President Trump said or didn't say, what he meant, what he didn't mean, what I can tell you is communities are having to engage in all kinds of activities that they never would have had if this administration would have simply enforced the laws in place. And so here we are.
And made the safety of the American people a priority, which it has not been for 3.5 years. I'm going to yield back my time and yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. And I did want to note that the chairman was correct that there was no House bill reflecting the compromise that was worked out in the Senate to address the border and the immigration issues that we see at the border. And that is because the former president told everybody he didn't want it to happen because he wanted to run on the issue. And before the bill text had even been released in the Senate, Speaker Mike Johnson said it would be dead on arrival in the House, and therefore it was never filed in the House. At any rate, getting back to the bills at hand here.
Will the gentlelady yield?
We have, let me just finish my remarks, please.
I wish it was that easy to stop you.
So, HR 7909, the Violence Against Women Act, or Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act. We've heard from the ranking member that this bill is redundant. It simply repeats things that are already in place, and we have confirmation of that because its CBO score is negligible. Its CBO score is negligible because it does not do anything that does not happen under current law. So there's no additional cost because, once again, it's solving a problem that doesn't exist. The other bill, look, Republicans like federalism as long as it works for them, but the second that cities and states make different policy judgments that Republicans disagree with, then they respond with radical policies to try to impose the results they prefer, even at the cost of undermining public health and safety, violating human rights, or bankrupting some of our country's largest cities. So these bills do not serve a genuine legislative purpose. They are part of a suite of bills, a same old playbook, which is just trying over and over and over again to raise conspiracy theories and demonize immigrants in our country in order to create an election issue rather than solving those issues that actually do arise. So was there anything you wanted to add, Mr. Nadler?
No, I think you've said it well.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Bless you.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out which microphone I was supposed to use. Thank you very much, and would yield to Ms. Houchin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's rich to hear the other side of the aisle say that what Republicans are doing with respect to the border and these cities is undermining public health, safety, and bankrupting cities. I think letting 10 million or more illegal immigrants flooding into the country is what's doing the most to undermine public health, public safety, and bankrupting our cities. The city of Springfield never asked for what they have. This is a real problem, and we're getting distracted, I think, because that's what the left wants us to do. They want to distract us from the issue of the wide open southern border that's causing so much havoc to our country, that has resulted in fentanyl deaths, all as Congressman Biggs, you mentioned, all as a result of the executive orders signed by Joe Biden on day one to undo all of Trump's border policies. That's why we're here today. That's why Republicans are supporting No Bailout for Sanctuary Cities Act and the Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act. We've seen Democrats vote against bills that would deport illegals here who have committed violent crimes like the murder of Laken Riley. They don't even want to deport them. So it's easy, I think, to try to distract us with these things that they are pointing to, these other shiny objects, because they cannot look at the American people and answer to the crisis that they have self-made and brought upon this country by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's wide open border policies. I will just leave it to Congressman Biggs if you'd like to make any further comment.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we heard two arguments from the previous speaker. Number one is that the Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act is simply unnecessary. Yet if you look at this and you look at it realistically, which is all I'm asking, is just look at this realistically. If you take, for example, the fact that under current immigration law, there is no explicit ground of inadmissibility for illegal aliens who commit domestic violence offenses, despite a ground of removability for aliens who commit such offenses. So in other words, we need to have the mandate, right? I mean, that's really what we're getting at here. Or consider that despite certain sex offenses making aliens removable from the country, there's currently not a ground of inadmissibility or removability specific to sex offenses. So when you say this is redundant, no, it's clarifying. Not only are we clarifying, we're making it mandatory. And this notion of federalism doesn't work if you're getting billions of dollars from the federal government and you flout the federal side of it. Because if you were, let's say you're a donor state, like my state's a donor state, we want that back. We want that back, whatever they're giving to California. Yeah, we would like to get our dollar for dollar that we're giving to the federal government. We're not going to get it, but we're going to follow we're going to not be a sanctuary state. We have one sanctuary county. But other than that, we're all trying to do the law, just like in Texas. Why should we subsidize a state, city, or county that refuses to follow federal law?
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for questions.
Thank you. Project 2025 is here and alive and well in September 2024. Project 2025's attack on immigrants is intended to whip up hatred and fear. And this is a bill with a title and no real impact. The Violence Against Women Act is so important for women across the country. 463,000 women are abused and raped every year. 172 Republicans voted against the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women. 172 Republicans voted against the reauthorization of the act that is intended to protect women from violence, from abuse, from rape, from kidnapping, including every Republican on this committee and Mr. Biggs, if they were in the office at that time. So when we have a bill that is intended to address an issue, but is duplicative, doesn't add significant protections, but has a title like the one this has, I recognize that it is pure political theater. And it's clear it's political theater when we look at those groups who are dedicated to protecting women from that violence have actually said this is not a good bill because it has these problems. In their hurry to come up with something, they created a problem. So instead of fixing something, they're creating a problem. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record the letter of opposition from nearly 200 national and local groups as part of the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence that the ranking member referenced earlier.
That objection is ordered.
And I want to read this sentence from that letter. We said that everybody was against this, that's focused on this. And the sentence is, "We are troubled that this legislation fails to include waivers that take into account the needs of the victim or their family, and that it will limit the discretion that judges can exercise where the equities warrant, including situations where survivors who are inadvertently caught up in the criminal legal system will be harmed," close quote. I think, Ranking Member, that's the example you gave of if there is an immigrant who acts in self-defense, let's say it's a woman, it's not always women, but mostly women, that immigrant might be subject to deportation. That's the kind of thing that people are worried about, right, from this legislation.
Yes.
Right? So, I think that that's the issue here, is it's not doing anything more than what the existing law does in essence. And I also point out 6,000 women die each year from guns. 6,000 women die each year from guns. We're not doing anything about that. Nothing. Republicans don't even take it up. Ranking member, is there anything else you want to add on any of these bills?
Well, let me give you an example of how a domestic violence survivor might be implicated by this bill if it were enacted. A young woman who is here legally on a student visa is in an abusive relationship, and her boyfriend tried to rape her. She fought back and bit his ear, causing it to bleed. She called the police, but because, this is an actual instance, she called the police, but because of language issues and the fact that he was bleeding, the police assumed she was the aggressor and arrested her. She was convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence, though the judge sentenced her to time already served after hearing the larger context of the abuse that she had suffered. Under this bill, this lawful immigrant and survivor of domestic abuse would be deported. And this is not a one-off. There are countless examples of victims of domestic violence fighting back against their abusers and ending up with domestic violence convictions of their own. This issue is so pervasive that Oklahoma had to enact a bill earlier this year to allow for leniency for individuals charged with attacking their abusers. The other danger of this bill is that by using the VAWA definition of domestic violence, and I mentioned this before, a definition that itself states includes conduct that is not criminal, domestic violence survivors who use nonviolent means of resisting their abusers, including verbal abuse and segregating money, would be subject to removal.
I think that's really important to actually hear examples of how this kind of bill intended to just be able messaging. It's all about politics. It's not about making women safer. Because if they were concerned about making women safer, they would have voted for the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization in the first place. I just want to, this whole thing about Vance and Ohio, this quote really got me of J.D. Vance, because there's just been this whole, the pets and the dogs and all of this attention on this town, this poor town. And J.D. Vance's quote is, "If I have to create stories so that the American media actually pays attention, then that's what I'm going to do, right? But when people create stories, and stories in this instance is not true, it has negative consequences, and I think that's what's concerning."
I heard him say that on Meet the Press, and he used exactly the same language on Face the Nation.
Yeah.
And what he's saying, in effect, is, if I have to lie to get people to pay attention to this, I will lie. The chairman of the committee, Mr. Burgess, the chairman, says that the threats to Springfield came from abroad. That may be, but the threats nonetheless were threats, and they caused the mayor of Springfield to have to close the schools for several days. And we don't know whether they're continuing or not. But when the threats come that, even if they're from abroad, that causes the mayor to have to close the schools for several days, and these threats are because the former president and Senator Vance knowingly lied about Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs. Well, this is really intolerable.
And I need to say that your comment reminded me, I was at a school that had suffered through a mass shooting. And every time there is another shooting at a school, that poor high school that already went through that trauma gets additional threats and has to shut down, have a hold. And for those children and those students, it is significant. So to sort of brush off the fact of where the threats came from, they shut down that school, and every child who should have been learning was impacted by those lies and that hatred, and we should all condemn it rather than saying it's okay. And with that, Mr. Chairman, unless my ranking member doesn't want to add anything, I'll yield back. Well, I won't yield back then if I mean, you don't look like you want to respond, and I'm the last one. We'll be done if you don't.
You know, I always want to respond. I mean, come on, really. I just respond with a couple points, and I'll try to be quick because I know Mr. McGovern's here, and he might want to grill me. I don't know, but here's the thing. I keep hearing about Project 2025, and you know what? I've looked at it, but I hope that when people talk about Project 2025, they can actually give me a citation to whatever you're saying because I don't know.
I will send it to you.
Yeah, would you? I would. I seriously would like it. I would like it because it's a massive, big honking book, and I haven't had a chance to go through it, and I haven't looked at it at all, to be frank with you, and I'm not sure very many have. But be that as it may, when we start talking about trauma, because you were talking about trauma, yes, it's huge.
Got some sticky here, the places in which Project 25 raises these issues, so we will send.
Okay, good, very good. I'd like that.
To you. Yeah.
So when you start talking about trauma, though, that's exactly what both these bills actually are getting at: is how do you respond to the trauma of someone who's been violated or a victim, and the language. So if we're going to read language. I'm not going to read this language because it's all in front of you, but I'm looking at it, and I would say that there's a lot of misconstruction here and misinterpretation of this. But the language is pretty clear here. And if we're concerned about trauma, both these bills deal with that. One deals with the fact that you have sanctuary states, cities, and counties that are releasing people on the streets and not turning them over to ICE where they should be. We've got a lot of ICE. There are a lot of ICE beds available for detention of individuals right now, frankly, and they should. That's where they should be going, particularly if they're violent in nature. So that's all I'll say, and I look forward to
getting the citations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I know since it is still my time, Ranking Member Nadler wants to respond.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I simply want to point out that if these bills weren't very harmful to victims of domestic violence, the 200 domestic violence groups whose names were read into the record by unanimous consent would not object to these bills.
Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Yeah, I'm going to spare everybody my questioning because, quite frankly, I don't think it's worth it because I don't think either of these bills is ever going to get anywhere near becoming law. But I will. I really wish we were spending our time preparing a clean CR, short-term CR, to keep the government open, because that's something the American people want us to do.
Well, of course, as you know, a CR was part of our rule last week, and you may get a chance to vote on it before the week is done.
I mean, I don't. Do you have the votes now?
Yeah.
Do you have the votes on the CR that you pulled? You're in charge, not me.
I didn't pull it. Mr. Biggs, I just wanted to ask you before we finish this panel, a lot of talk about Project 2025, whoever wrote that, but you were actually quoting from
Trump
an ACLU
yes.
Questionnaire that was filled out by the vice president herself. So those are her words, and I just wonder if, in addition to providing the Project 2025 verbiage, you would be willing to share with us the verbiage of the vice president in answer to the questionnaire from ACLU in 2019, I guess.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll get that language for you, and I'd ask it to be made part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Seeing no further questions for this panel is excused, and we thank you for your thoughtful testimony.
Sorry, we took longer than we should have.
I would now like to welcome our fourth panel, Chairwoman Fox and Mr. Soblin from the Committee on Education and Workforce, to the witness table. We'll wait a moment for Chairwoman Fox. I hear her. She's in the hallway, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here we go. Okay, we have two bills tonight. Would you like me to do the opening statement on both of those? Okay. HR 5, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, other members of the committee who are here. HR 5339, the Protecting Americans' Investments from Woke Policies Act, is a bill that responds to the Biden-Harris administration's attack on Americans' hard-earned retirement savings. The administration implemented a rule that enables and encourages retirement plan fiduciaries to consider or choose investments based on environmental, social, and governance ESG impact. This is irresponsible because ESG funds are notorious underperformers and relatively high risk, leaving the future of retirees less secure. Advancing a radical political agenda at the expense of retirement savers is wrong. Americans invest to secure a brighter future for themselves and their families, not to bankroll Democrats' radical initiatives and pet projects. The four bills included in the Protecting Americans' Investment from Woke Policies Act seek to ensure financial institutions are focused on maximizing returns in retirement plans rather than woke ESG factors. Representative Allen's Rollback ESG to Increase Retirement Earnings or Retire Act clarifies that financial institutions must base decisions on an investment solely on economic factors. Representative Houchin's Retirement Proxy Protection Act states that the decision to exercise shareholder rights is subject to the prudence and loyalty duties under the Employment Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA. Moreover, it states that proxies held by ERISA plans must be voted in the economic interest of the plan, not used to advance radical policies. Representative Good's No Discrimination and My Benefits Act declares that race, color, religion, sex, or national origin may not be taken into consideration when selecting a fiduciary, counsel, employee, or service provider of an ERISA plan. Finally, Representative Banks providing complete information to Retirement Investors Act implements a notice requirement on defined contribution plans, explaining the difference between choosing from investments selected by investment fiduciaries and choosing from investments through a brokerage window. Together, these bills demonstrate the Republican commitment to protecting the retirement savings of workers, retirees, and their families. With that, I urge the Rule Committee to report H.R. 5339 with an appropriate rule. Would you like me to go ahead and do the second? Okay. Everyone knows that free speech is under attack on college campuses. H.R. 3724, the End Woke Higher Education Act, incorporates two bills that refuse to surrender American universities to the anti-free speech zealots. Representative Owens' Accreditation for College Experience Act and Representative Williams' Respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act. Representative Owens' Accreditation for College Excellence Act ensures colleges are not forced to adopt DEI dogma to receive accreditation. It also ensures accreditors' standards do not require, encourage, or coerce an institution to support or oppose specific partisan or political beliefs or viewpoints on social or political issues, or support the disparate treatment of any individual or group. Prohibits accreditors from assessing an institution's commitment to any ideology, belief, or viewpoint for the purpose of receiving accreditation for Higher Education Act funding. Protects the college's religious mission and a religious accreditor's ability to require adherence with religious practices or codes of conduct, and ensures that an accreditor cannot require, encourage, or coerce an institution to violate any right protected by the Constitution. Representative Williams, respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act, ensures the full sweep of the First Amendment is adhered to by public college campuses. It also makes free speech on campus a condition of receiving Title IV funds under the HEA, ensures students are educated on their First Amendment rights, safeguards the freedoms of association and religion on campus, prohibits institutions from forcing students, faculty, or applicants to take political litmus tests, and requires all institutions to discuss annually First Amendment policies held by the institution. The bottom line is that universities should not have policies and practice that unconstitutionally regulate the marketplace of ideas on their campuses. Too many universities and accreditors have abandoned their mission to equip students to discover the truth and think for themselves. The End Woke Higher Education Act reverses this trend by upholding Americans' constitutional rights and restoring viewpoint diversity throughout post-secondary education. And by the way, today is Constitution Day, so it's very appropriate that we are dealing with these bills. With that, I urge the Rules Committee to report H.R. 3724 with an appropriate rule.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair, thanks. Mr. Sablon, you're recognized for your opening statement.
I guess this has been on. Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the Rules Committee. Today I'm here to talk about two proposals that are that are part of Congressional Republicans' larger so-called anti-woke agenda. H.R. 3724, the End Woke Higher Education Act, and H.R. 5339, the Protecting Americans' Investments from Woke Policies Act. Before I get into the specifics about each of these bills and why I oppose them, I would like to briefly comment on the Republicans' agenda this week. The bills we're considering this week are messaging bills. Messaging, just that. No substance, just messaging. They do nothing tangible to improve the Americans' lives. They are mere tools for my colleagues to message on and distract Americans from the fact that my colleagues are abdicating their sole responsibility as members of Congress to fund the government. We're 2 weeks away from a government shutdown, and my colleagues have no credible plan to avert it. H.R. 3724, the first bill this panel is considering, the so-called End Woke Higher Education Act. It is nothing more than a view attack on diversity and academic freedom in college curricula and establish constitutional free speech precedents on college campuses. It mirrors language in the House Republican so-called College Cost Reduction Act, which alters the standards under which accrediting bodies determine the quality of institutions of higher education. Additionally, H.R. 3724 incorporates the text of H.R. 7683, the Respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act, a bill that attempts an end run around the First Amendment to set up a whole new scheme to regulate speech and association rights on campus outside of established precedents and practices. The First Amendment protects some of the most deeply cherished rights we have as Americans. Any student who currently believes their First Amendment rights are being violated can bring a federal case against their public college or university. In doing so, they have over 200 years of precedent and case law that carefully define and determine how the First Amendment is to be interpreted and enforced in that situation. That includes precedents that specifically address the unique nature of colleges and universities as public entities that both must uphold constitutional rights and provide students with safe learning environments. If the courts rule for the student, the school must stop its action. But with this bill today before us, before this committee, the majority would have us throw those centuries of case law out the window and replace it with a hastily drafted substitute that claims to remove barriers that limit constitutional rights. What the bill actually does is make public colleges and universities who could be acting in good faith, attempting to protect the safety and security of everyone present on their campus, subject to monetary judgment and potential loss of Title 4.8, counter to Supreme Court precedent. In doing so, my colleagues who purport to be in favor of limited government are micromanaging how colleges and institutions handle their internal processes of governance. In addition to micromanaging how college campuses dispute First Amendment cases, this bill will also undermine the legitimacy of college accreditation. For decades, federally recognized accreditors have served as 1/3 of the oversight triad for the U.S. higher education system, along with the states and the federal government. Accreditation is meant to be the gold standard for college quality and performance. After all, accreditation is the gateway to billions of dollars in federal student aid each year. And I recognize that the accreditation system needs significant reforms. Unfortunately, H.R. 3724 does not make those critical reforms. Rather, it is a baseless attempt to inject culture war into the ever-important accreditation process. For example, the prohibition on litmus tests invites additional federal oversight into the accreditation process. And under this bill, accreditors may not assess a school's commitment to any ideology, belief, or viewpoint. The majority claims this would prevent a school from losing accreditation if they do not have a diversity, equity, and inclusion office. The reality is there is no evidence of that happening. There are conversely several examples of state officials pressuring schools not to teach certain classes or whole subjects that they believe cross the line between academic pursuit and ideological beliefs. And this is why this bill is so dangerous. For example, again, under this bill, the Department of Education could potentially revoke an accreditor's recognition over a claim that its standards for biology programs require the teaching of evolution, or the refusal to accredit a geology curriculum that dates the age of the Earth at 6,000 years, suggesting such standards were attempt to force a university to commit to a specific partisan, political, or ideological viewpoint or belief. H.R. 3724 represents a solution in search of a problem and fundamentally seeks to undermine students' First Amendment rights and our accreditation system. I oppose this bill, and I also urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. With your permission, Chairman Burr, may I go on the next? Thank you. Thank you very much. The next bill before us is H.R. 5339, the so-called Protecting Americans' Investments from Woke Policies Act. Workers should be able to invest in a way that reflects their values, whether combating climate change or promoting health and labor standards without sacrificing investment returns. Environmental, social, and governance, ESG, factors enable workers to be informed about potential risks and opportunities when evaluating an investment portfolio. The financial services industry recognizes the importance of considering ESG factors. For instance, State Street Global Advisors, one of the largest asset managers, noted that as a fiduciary, they have a duty to act prudently and in the best interest of their clients, which increasingly includes consideration of environmental, social, and governance factors relevant to the performance of the companies in which our clients invest. Just good business. Instead of ensuring retirees have sound investing advice, H.R. 5339 would needlessly inject partisan politics into workers' retirement investment decisions. The Biden-Harris administration has issued common sense rules related to ESG investing and proxy voting This bill will replace those rules with flawed and unpopular ones from the Trump era. H.R. 5339 is premised on the Republicans' mistaken view that they know best when it comes to ESG investing, while Democrats continue to trust the professionals who are legally bound to make prudent decisions on behalf of retirement plan participants. Moreover, H.R. 5339 would undermine efforts to increase diversity among asset managers. This is a worthwhile endeavor. As the Government Accountability Office noted a few years ago, only 1% of the $70 trillion in global assets under management are managed by firms owned by women or people of color. There is also research to suggest that non-diverse firms do not outperform diverse firms across all asset classes. I oppose this bill, and I also urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. So, Mr. Chairman, these so-called anti-woke policies we're considering are not only regressive, they're also limiting important conversations about race, gender, and inequality. I wish my colleagues did not insist on burying their heads in the sand about the changing world around us and instead join our efforts to create a more just and inclusive society. Americans are not interested in going back. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. We thank both of our witnesses for their thoughtful comments before the committee. I have no specific questions, but I do want to acknowledge that later this week, there's going to be a portrait of Dr. Fox that is going to be hung, if that's the right word, in the committee room. And you're very deserving of that recognition. Dr. Fox, you, of course, were such a valuable member of this committee when I was but a young pup on the far end of the dais, and I always looked to you for wise counsel and guidance as one of the more senior members on the Rules Committee. But I know you've ably led the Committee on Education and Workforce, and we're so grateful for your leadership. I know you always put your constituents first, but please trust me, you are loved by everyone here in the Rules Committee. We do miss you, and we're always glad to see you back. But again, congratulations on the portrait this week.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess.
Yes, we may applaud.
Appreciate it. No. I tried my best to keep them from doing it, but
to no avail.
No avail. That's right.
Sometimes people just won't listen. They need a good scolding. Once a teacher, always a teacher.
Well, thank you for your kind comments. I am grateful for the opportunities I've had to serve here.
Wonderful. Well, I will yield to the ranking member of the Rules Committee.
Well, I too want to congratulate you on your portrait and your service, but you know, I'm very disappointed with these two bills, which comes as no surprise to the chairwoman. And I think Mr. Sablan characterized them correctly when he talked about them as messaging bills. I mean, we have some important business before us, mainly to keep the government open, keep it running, and instead we are spending a week on very partisan bills. This is anti-woke week. And as I said earlier, instead of anti-woke week, I wish the Republican majority would wake the hell up.
I wish I can go
and actually,
home every weekend.
Yeah, and actually do and keep the government open, which is, I don't think is a tall order, but in any event, so I have no questions. I yield back.
Sure, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. And again, I would point out you will have an opportunity to vote on that this week.
Well,
the gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Gentlelady, I guess the question is whether we're voting on a clean CR or we're voting on a CR that's filled up with all kinds of very partisan.
I would remind the gentleman we passed a rule last week.
You did. You didn't bring the bill up, and that bill's going nowhere. So that's not a serious attempt.
The rule has been passed, and we'll take the bill up under the rule.
No further questions from me. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing the painting.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady, and I want to thank our witnesses. I know it's been a long day, and I appreciate you hanging with us and appreciate your testimony and your valuable insights on these bills. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, and this panel is excused. Without objection, the committee stands in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, but quickly, I have a study, a report I'd like to put in the minutes. Okay.
I will introduce it when we reconvene.
If you'll do it for me, I'd appreciate it.
And I beg the same, Mr. Chairman, I just insert a statement for the record.
I can give it to you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, thank you.
Oh. Do me a favor.
Call the committee back to order. I want to welcome our fifth panel, Subcommittee Chairman Carter and Subcommittee Ranking Member Tonko from the Committee on Energy and Commerce to the witness table. Just prior to their testimony, I do want to ask unanimous consent that an article left by Chairwoman Virginia Fox on study finds top medical schools value left-wing activism over science. Ask that that be made as part of the record, ask unanimous consent that that be made part of the record. And then I also have a unanimous consent request from Mr. Sablon on the Statement of Administration Policy and a number of letters in support of his position. Ask unanimous consent that that be made part of the record without objection. So ordered. Chairman Carter, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member and members of the Rules Committee. I'm pleased to be with you today. I urge prompt consideration of HJ Res 136, a resolution offered by our colleague John James that provides congressional disapproval of the EPA's rule relating to multi-pollutant emission standards for model years 2027 and later light-duty and medium-duty vehicles. This is not the first time we've voted on the Biden-Harris administration's efforts to force 2/3 of Americans into cars that they do not want and cannot afford. The time is most urgent of them all. EPA's final regulation simultaneously eliminates Americans' ability to decide which vehicle best suits their lives and promotes China's dominance for our auto industry. It does this by setting emission standards at a level that prevents liquid fuels from primarily powering most new vehicles. Our country does not have the infrastructure to support such a fanciful and forced transition, and consumers are not warming to it. HJ Res 136 is the last exit off this expressway of bad choices made by this rule. I and most of my Republican colleagues do not oppose the sale of electric vehicles in this nation. What we do have a problem with is the government co-opting this marketplace based on ideological and practical solutions. Last year, EVs, or battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, comprised 8.4% of all new cars sold and made up around 1% of all registered vehicles on America's roads. EPA's regulations considered the creation of 3 potential scenarios, and no projection were electric vehicles expected to be less than 69% of new car sales, a 700% mandated market increase. Conversely, internal combustion engine vehicles would be no more than 29% of new car sales. That translates into a 69% required decrease in market availability. Setting aside this regulation's gross market manipulation, the country is not ready for this radical disruption. The average annual salary nationwide is only $59,000. In May of 2024, Edmunds.com stated that the average fully electric model with a starting MSRP of $53,000 was $17,000 more than the average for a gas-burning compact crossover. The National Association of Auto Dealers also maintained that current market incentives are not sufficient and high EV prices will price out millions of consumers. If you still need to be convinced, Cox Automotive stated, in 2024, the Cox Automotive team is expecting that the industry will fully come to terms with the fact that the average consumer has to be sold on the merits of going electric, and many won't be easily convinced. They realize EVs are not selling, and they can only offset their losses with gas-powered vehicles for so long. To illustrate, in the 3-month period ending in June, Ford lost about $44,000 on every electric vehicle it sold. Finally, allowing this regulation to continue unabated would enable China to co-opt the U.S. auto market. China currently dominates the EV industry and critical mineral supply chains, controlling some 76% of global battery cell production capacity for electric vehicles, around 75% of all lithium-ion batteries, and much of the processing and refining capacity for over half of the world's lithium, cobalt, and graphite. Plus, China's major auto companies are already well established in Mexico for sales in the U.S., with plans to continue investing. Our security, our public health, and our welfare are best served without this regulation, and I urge HJ Res 136 consideration.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Burgess and Ranking Member McGovern and members of the committee for the opportunity to share my opinion. I am here in strong opposition to this joint resolution of disapproval to nullify EPA's emission standards for light and medium-duty vehicles and block any future similar action. This resolution is yet another extreme Republican attack on common-sense steps that EPA is taking to protect Americans' health and the environment. First, I am disappointed that instead of focusing efforts to keep the government open, the majority is wasting time by advancing a joint resolution that they know has no chance at becoming law. For starters, it is my understanding that the Senate's ability to use the Congressional Review Act's fast-track procedures has already expired on this rule, meaning this resolution is no longer privileged and would be considered under normal Senate procedures. Senate Republicans have already publicly admitted that they have abandoned their strategy of using the CRA this Congress. And House Republicans already attempted to block this rule last year, which Democrats overwhelmingly opposed and the Senate completely ignored. The CRA is just another tired attempt to deny Americans of the tremendous public health, economic, and climate benefits of EPA's light and medium-duty vehicle standards. Because we know that is exactly what EPA standards will do: strengthen climate and public health protections, support American manufacturing, and indeed lower costs for families. The standards will significantly reduce air and climate pollution by abating over 7 billion metric tons of carbon pollution between 2027 and 2055, while cutting other harmful pollutants. The transportation sector is the single largest source of climate pollution, so this rule is a major step in the right direction. Clean vehicle standards are also a win for the economy, since EPA estimates that the final rule will result in $99 billion, that's billion with a B, in net benefits to society annually. Of course, that includes lower health care costs, but the bulk of those benefits go to consumers' wallets in the form of reduced fuel costs and vehicle maintenance. All told, American families are expected to save an average of $6,000 over the lifetime of a vehicle. These standards also support significant job growth opportunities. EPA anticipates net employment growth in the auto manufacturing sector of up to 188,000 jobs in 2032. U.S. auto manufacturing is already investing in clean vehicle manufacturing, having injected $188 billion in the sector since President Biden took office and adding nearly 200,000 jobs. If Congress is able to upend these standards, it will create considerable regulatory uncertainty for American auto manufacturers, undermining those job-creating investments. Despite all of this, we will hear from House Republicans that EPA's rule is an EV mandate. This is simply not true. As required by the law, the Clean Air Act, EPA standards are performance-based, not technology prescriptive. These standards allow for significant flexibility for auto manufacturers and provide consumers with a wide range of options, including battery electric, plug-in hybrids, hydrogen fuel cells, and even improved internal combustion engines. EPA worked with a wide array of stakeholders, from auto manufacturers and auto workers to public health and environmental organizations, to address concerns and develop a final rule that is both ambitious and achievable. This is really a lose-lose resolution. By adopting a just say no attitude to common sense climate and clean air protections, not only is the majority burying their heads in the sand in the face of the climate crisis, we're also ceding ground to China on EV manufacturing. I would rather the United States continue to fight for its share of the EV supply chain, and those domestic manufacturing investments and all the jobs they support will only happen with long-term policy certainty, both incentives like those included in the Inflation Reduction Act and the standards we are discussing today. I, for one, will continue to bet on American ingenuity, innovation, and ability to compete and lead the global race for clean vehicles. And EPA standards are an important part of those efforts. HJ Resolution 136 is an attack on EPA's Clean Air Act authority and obligation to protect Americans and the environment from dangerous air pollution, and it should be rejected. With that, I strongly oppose this joint resolution, and I yield back. And again, thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank both the gentlemen. The gentleman yields back. Chair thanks both the gentlemen for their appearance today. I will just say that I have an over 20-year history of being a student and a consumer of hybrid technology, and I do believe that was the way to go years ago, but for whatever reason, first in the Obama administration, now carried over in the Biden administration, they've had this irrational push to all electric vehicles. The hybrid was the perfect the perfect transition type of vehicle to where the focus should have been applied. But instead, this is the reason why the average American really dislikes the regulatory regime that is confronting them literally every day. A $7,500 subsidy to go for a rich person to buy a toy for their third car to go with their jet ski and their sailboat. Regular Americans do not want that. They do not need that. They need help. If you want to provide help in the terms of $7,500 just paying their grocery bill because we ran the cost up so much with the Inflation Reduction Act, that's where people would be interested. But they're not interested in the type of regulation that's coming out of the EPA right now. They will not be interested in the future. And at some point people are going to wise up. But with that, I've said enough. I'll yield to the ranking member.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say I disagree with your assessment. I agree with Tonko, and I have no questions.
Gentleman hates hybrid vehicles. Very good. Thank you both for your testimony today. Oh, I beg your pardon. You completely obscured the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. I'll now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
I'll just associate myself with the ranking member's remarks. Thank you, Mr. Tonko.
Thank you both. Thanks for being accommodating on the length of your testimony. And at this point, the committee stands. Is there any other member wishing to testify, or any other member wishing to question these witnesses? If not, they are excused. Is there anyone else seeking to testify on HJ Res 136, HR 3724, HR 4790, HR 5179, HR 5339, HR 5717, and HR 7909? Seeing none, without objection, this closes the hearing portion of our meeting. And without objection, the committee stands in recess subject to the call of the chair. call the Committee on Rules back to order. Chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Houchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee grant H.R. 3724, the End Woke Higher Education Act, a structured rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and the Workforce or their respective designees. The rule provides that in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Education and the Workforce, now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 118-49 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only the amendments printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report. Each amendment shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. All points of order against the amendments printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report are waived. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 4790, the Prioritizing Economic Growth Over Woke Policies Act, under a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Financial Services, now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 118-48, modified by the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services or their respective designees. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 5179, the Anti-BDS Labeling Act, under a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Ways and Means shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means or their respective designees. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 5339, the Protecting Americans' Investments from Woke Policies Act, under a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Education and the Workforce, now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee Print 118-50 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member on the Committee on Education and the Workforce or their respective designees. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 5717, the No Bailout for Sanctuary Cities Act, under a structured rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their respective designees. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule makes in order only the amendments printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report. Each amendment shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. All points of order against the amendments printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report are waived. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 7909, the Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act, under a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary, now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 118-47 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their respective designees. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.J. Res. 136, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code, of the rule submitted by the Environmental Protection Agency relating to, quote, multi-pollutant emission standards for model years 2027 and later, light-duty and medium-duty vehicles. The chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their respective designees. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion. Is there any discussion or amendment to the
Yes,
rule?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
So firstly, I want to say this without questioning anybody's motives, but across the 7 measures that we have before us today, 34 amendments were submitted. 25 of those 34 amendments were submitted by Democrats. Zero of those 25 Democratic amendments were made in order. At the same time, 5 of 9 Republican amendments were made in order. That's over half. So Republicans not only get to write the bills, but they also block all of our amendments from even being voted on. How does that make any sense? How is that even remotely fair? At the start of the Congress, Republicans promised more openness and more opportunity for ideas to win at the end of the day. That promise has been broken. It's been broken badly. This Republican majority knows their bills fail to address real problems, so they continue to block our good ideas from coming to the floor rather than debating them. They don't want to let the American people hear our ideas, and that tells you everything you need to know. Mr. Chairman, I have a few amendments which I'd like to offer.
Gentleman is recognized.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendment number 8 to H.R. 4790, offered by Representative Vargas, which directs the SEC to conduct an economic analysis of all the proposals in Division C. If the economic analysis finds that the proposals within the division limit information that investors consider material or limit the ability for shareholders to submit proposals, those limits cannot go into effect. Mr. Chairman, I don't understand how my friends on the other side of the aisle can claim to be against censorship and claim to support transparency and at the same time limit the information that investors can access to make informed decisions. I just don't get it. If my friends are so certain that this bill wouldn't disempower stakeholders and investors, then this amendment is a no-brainer, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Any further discussion of the amendment? Hearing none, the question is then on the amendment. Those in favor will vote aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
As for roll call?
Roll call has been requested. The clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Reschenthaler. No. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Massey. No. Mr. Massey, no. Mr. Norman. No. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy. No. Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin. No. Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy. No. Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. Scott. No. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Neguse. Ms. Leisure-Fernandez.
Aye.
Ms. Leisure-Fernandez, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Chair votes no.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
And the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Any other amendment or discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendment number 6 to H.R. 4790, offered by Representative Garcia of Texas, which prevents the bill's provisions from taking effect unless federal banking regulators certify that climate is not a risk to the safety and soundness of the entities affected or the U.S. financial system. Mr. Chairman, corporations that are actively managing and planning for climate change secure an 18% higher return on investment than companies that are not, and 67% higher than companies who refuse to disclose their emissions. So we know this effort isn't about helping investors, but about catering to far-right extremists and protecting big corporations at the expense of working-class people. If climate truly should not be taken into account in investment practices, then let's have the data to show it before proceeding with this ill-advised bill. And I urge a yes vote, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? Seeing none, the question is on the motion from the gentleman from Massachusetts. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Roll call has been requested. The clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Reschenthaler. No. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Massey. No. Mr. Massey, no. Mr. Norman. No. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin? Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy? Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, no. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Leisure-Fernandez? Ms. Leisure-Fernandez, aye. Mr. Chairman?
Chair votes no.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
And the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Any other discussion or amendment to the rule?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Massachusetts
I
is
have an amendment
recognized.
to the rule. I move the committee make and order amendments number 18 and 19 to H.R. 4790, offered by Ranking Member Waters. Amendment number 18 would require public companies to disclose whenever they eliminate any employees or offices within the company tasked with enhancing the company's commitment to promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion within its workforce and business practices. Amendment number 19 would allow regulators to encourage financial firms to increase access to credit for small and minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, and veteran-owned businesses. Mr. Chairman, all this anti-DEI nonsense, anti-DEI nonsense does is serve as yet another culture war attack and make it easier for corporations to get away with mismanagement. None of this actually helps investors, none of it. Let's help our minority-owned small businesses. Let's help expand diversity and inclusion in the private sector, and let's hold corporations accountable. And I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Is there any further discussion on the amendment from the gentleman from Massachusetts? If seeing none, the question is on the amendment from the gentleman from Massachusetts. Those in favor will vote aye.
Aye.
Those opposed vote no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Ask for roll call.
Roll call has been requested. The clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Reschenthaler?
No.
Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach?
No.
Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey, no. Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin? Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy? Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, no. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Leisure-Fernandez? Ms. Leisure-Fernandez, aye. Mr. Chairman?
Chair votes no.
Mr. Chairman, no.
The clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
And the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Any further discussion or amendment to the rule?
There are no further amendments, Mr. Chairman. I would just again end by saying this is extremely disappointing. I yield back.
Hearing no other requests for further amendments, the question is on the motion from the gentleman from Indiana. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. A roll call has been, a recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey, aye. Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy, aye. Mrs. Houchin? Mrs. Houchin, aye. Mr. Langworthy? Mr. Langworthy, aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Neguse? Ms. Leisure-Fernandez? Ms. Leisure-Fernandez, no. Mr. Chairman?
Chair votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
The clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
And the ayes have it. The motion to report is agreed to. Accordingly, Ms. Houchin will manage for the majority.
And to set the appropriate tone, I will manage it for the minority.
The gentleman from Massachusetts will manage for the majority. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.